We are stepping quietly into the monumental architecture of a single, deeply profound book.
Yes. Process and Reality, an essay in cosmology by Alfred Whitehead.
Right. And what we are undertaking right now, it isn't a brief overview. It's the very first step, the initial descent into a massive, continuous 10-part journey.
Into what is undeniably one of the most intricately woven philosophical frameworks ever conceived.
We are entering a space that requires a profound stillness to fully comprehend. Because this is just part one, we're going to build this foundation very carefully.
It is a text that really demands that kind of deliberate, measured approach.
Yeah.
To understand the sheer magnitude of the structure we are walking into, we first have to look at the atmosphere in which it was born.
Right, the context of the lectures.
Exactly. These concepts were originally delivered as the Gifford Lectures at the University of Edinburgh, stretching across the academic session of 1927 to 1928. Picture Alfred Whitehead at this time. He was 68 years old.
A man who had reached a point in his life where he was so intensely consumed by the fire of his own original thought that the ordinary, mundane world around him it began to fade into irrelevance.
Imagine being so caught up in the vibrations of the cosmos that you simply ignore your daily responsibilities.
There's actually a deeply revealing, rather amusing anecdote involving the philosopher Bertrand Russell regarding exactly that.
Oh, the letters.
Yeah, the letters. Russell once noted that Whitehead justified completely ignoring letters sent to him by stating that if he took the time to answer them, he would have no time left for original work.
It's essentially saying, sorry I didn't reply to your mail, Bertrand. I was busy redefining time and space.
Exactly. And Russell, who obviously understood the weight of Whitehead's intellect, found this justification to be, in his words, complete and unanswerable.
That uncompromising focus is the beautiful yet kind of problematic reality of pure genius. Because he prioritized new thought over meticulous review, the original editions of this book were released into the world absolutely riddled with hundreds of errors.
Because he just couldn't be bothered with proofreading.
Right. There were misreadings of his somewhat difficult handwriting, dropped commas that entirely changed the meaning of sentences, and inconsistent terminology.
So the journey we are embarking on today relies entirely upon a later, meticulously corrected edition. Without that careful reconstruction, navigating the density of Whitehead's vocabulary would be nearly impossible.
Looking at the vast table of contents gives us a map of the immense scale Whitehead is attempting. We are initiating our path here in part one, the speculative scheme.
And over the course of this journey, we will walk through the discussions and applications. We'll wade into the incredibly detailed microscopic analysis of the theory of prehensions.
We will cross the vast spatial mappings of the theory of extension, and we will finally arrive at the final interpretation.
It is a cosmology in the truest sense. But to begin, we must look to the preface. What exactly is his philosophical mission here? If he is looking back at the foundational giants Descartes, Newton, Locke, Hume, what is he trying to achieve?
His endeavor is a deliberate recurrence. It's a return to the pre-Kantian modes of thought. He is actively engaging with those giants, but his goal is not to passively agree with them.
He's looking for their mistakes.
Precisely. He has isolated the inconsistent presuppositions they left behind, the unresolved tensions in their theories, and he is attempting to correct them. He calls this massive corrective framework the philosophy of organism.
So if Whitehead looks at classical physics and says, you've got it wrong, the universe isn't a dead machine, what is his alternative? What kind of reality does he think we are actually living in?
Normally, under the influence of classical physics, we tend to imagine the universe as a collection of static matter, like little billiard balls bouncing around in a completely empty, indifferent void.
Just dead stuff crashing into other dead stuff.
Right. The philosophy of organism shatters that image. It asks you to view the universe not as a machine, but as a deeply interconnected, vibrating, living web.
Imagine looking at a dense, ancient forest. If you view it merely as separate, isolated columns of wood, you completely miss the reality.
The forest is a single breathing event.
Exactly, where the roots, the fungal networks, the soil, the oxygen, and the leaves are in a constant dynamic exchange of existence. That is the universe Whitehead is describing.
But before he can build that living forest for us, he has to clear out the conceptual deadwood. In the preface, he outlines a series of prevalent habits of Thought9-specific myths that he explicitly repudiates.
These are the very walls of the conceptual prison modern philosophy has built around itself. So how does he begin dismantling them? Let's go through them meticulously.
He begins by attacking the first myth, which is our modern distrust of speculative philosophy. Contemporary thought often demands immediate, empirical, isolated facts, viewing grand speculative systems as dangerous fantasies.
But Whitehead argues that without a speculative framework, our isolated facts remain mute. They are entirely meaningless without a broader system to interpret them.
Which leads to the second myth, which explains why we cling so tightly to the tools we already have, like language. He deconstructs our dangerous trust in language as an adequate expression of truth.
We have this quiet assumption that if we possess a word for a concept, we have fully captured its essence. But words are inherently static.
They evolved for practical, daily survival, for pointing at a tree or a rock. They did not evolve for mapping the ultimate dynamic complexities of the cosmos.
When we trust language too much, we force the fluid truth of the universe into rigid, unnatural boxes. And that rigidity in language bleeds directly into how we view ourselves, bringing us to the third myth, his repudiation of faculty psychology.
This is the somewhat antiquated yet deeply ingrained notion that the human mind operates in distinct, separate silos. It suggests we have one faculty purely for reasoning, another completely separate faculty for feeling, and another for physical sensation.
Whitehead entirely rejects this artificial compartmentalization. Think about how you make a decision in your everyday life. Modern psychology might tell you that your rational brain is fighting your emotional brain.
Whitehead thinks that's a total myth.
Right. When you feel anxious about a text message, or when you smell rain approaching, it's not compartmentalized into separate cognitive buckets. For him, a moment of experience is an indivisible, deeply integrated unity of emotion, purpose, and physical relation.
And that fragmentation is also reinforced by our grammar, which is the fourth myth he attacks, the subject-predicate form of expression.
We say, the rock is gray.
Yes, and by saying that, we unconsciously assume there is a completely independent substance called the rock, and it simply possesses a detached, secondary quality called grayness.
This grammatical structure tricks us into believing the universe is made of isolated subjects simply carrying around disconnected qualities rather than an intricate web of internal relations.
That grammatical trickery leads right into the fifth trap, the sensationalist doctrine of perception. This is the widespread assumption that your most basic primary interaction with the world is the reception of bare, meaningless sensory data.
The idea is that you take in meaningless patches of color or raw sounds, and your higher brain eventually processes them and attaches emotion to them later.
Whitehead argues the exact opposite. He states that our most primitive, fundamental experience of the world is deeply emotional and causal. We feel the heavy presence of the world before we ever consciously perceive a distinct shape or color.
This brings us to the sixth myth, the core of what Whitehead despises most, the doctrine of vacuous actuality. If you want to understand Whitehead, you must understand his visceral rejection of this concept.
Vacuous actuality is the idea that an entity can exist entirely on its own, completely devoid of any internal experience, subjectivity, or relation to anything else.
It is the concept of a completely dead, empty reality. He replaces this barren void with a universe where every actualized thing is a vibrant drop of experience.
If things aren't empty, then what about the Kantian idea that our minds are just projecting reality? That's the seventh myth. Whitehead goes after the Kantian doctrine of the objective world as a theoretical construct from pure subjectivity.
Kant argued that the true reality, the thing in itself, is forever unknowable, and our isolated minds simply project order onto the chaos.
Whitehead insists that we are not isolated minds projecting reality. We are entities deeply embedded within an objective, stubbornly real world that constantly forces itself upon us.
He then shifts his critique toward philosophical methodology for the eighth myth, warning against the reliance on arbitrary deductions in ex absurdo arguments.
Philosophers often try to prove a point by showing that the opposite argument leads to a logical absurdity.
Think of it like two mechanics arguing over a broken car. One says it's the battery, the other says it's the starter. The first mechanic proves the starter is perfectly fine and triumphantly declares, "See, it must be the battery."
But he is ignoring the fact that the engine itself might be missing entirely.
Exactly. Just because a competing theory breaks down doesn't mean your theory is the ultimate truth, especially if the fundamental categories you are both using are flawed from the very beginning.
That beautifully illustrates his final warning, the ninth myth. The belief that logical inconsistencies within a philosophical system are just minor calculation errors.
When a great thinker reaches a contradiction in their philosophy, it is rarely just a simple mistake.
No, it is a massive, glowing warning sign that the foundational premises they started with, their most basic assumptions about reality, are fundamentally inadequate.
So, with the deadwood of these 9 myths cleared away, what is the actual seed he plants? If he rejects the classical idea of a static, isolated substance, what does he build his universe out of?
He introduces the very core of his system, the actual entity. To grasp this, we can compare it to what Descartes called a substance.
For classical philosophy, a substance was the foundational stuff of reality, and its defining category was its quality.
Whitehead executes a radical paradigm shift here. He replaces the dominance of quality with the absolute dominance of relatedness. An actual entity is not defined by what it is in total isolation. It is entirely defined by how it prehends the rest of the universe.
Let's pause on that word. He uses this fascinating term, prehends, not comprehends, but prehends. It's like a blind grasping, a physical feeling of the universe pulling together. It's the way a plant prehends the sunlight, or the way you prehend the mood of a room the second you walk into it.
That is precisely it. An actual entity is a brief, microscopic event of becoming. It pulses into existence, prehends the universe from its unique perspective, achieves what Whitehead calls its final satisfaction, and then it perishes.
Wait, satisfaction. In everyday English, that just means I drank a great cup of coffee. But Whitehead is using it as a highly technical term here, isn't he?
He is. In Whitehead's vocabulary, satisfaction does not mean emotional contentment. It refers to the absolute completion of an actual entity's process of becoming.
It is the moment the entity has fully integrated all its prehensions into one unified, definite reality.
And once it reaches that satisfaction, its growth stops. It perishes.
But in this framework, perishing isn't vanishing into nothingness. And this brings us to the hauntingly beautiful concept of objective immortality.
Once the entity perishes, it becomes a stubborn, unchangeable fact.
The present, living reality that immediately follows does not ignore the dead, it actively appropriates it. Every new pulse of life is literally constructed out of the objective immortality of the dead.
It is a breathtaking way to view time. Everything in the universe is fundamentally tied together because the living are constantly built from the bodies of the past.
With this profound interconnectedness established, Whitehead formally defines the mission of speculative philosophy in Chapter 1. It is an incredibly dense, precise definition.
He defines it as the endeavor to frame a coherent, logical, necessary system of general ideas in terms of which every element of our experience can be interpreted.
There are 4 critical pillars holding up this definition. The scheme must be coherent, logical, applicable, and adequate. Let's look at that first pillar, coherent.
In a coherent system, the fundamental ideas inherently presuppose each other. You cannot isolate one concept and understand it perfectly without reference to the others.
Think of the architecture of Great Stone Cathedral. You cannot remove the keystone of an arch, lay it on the grass, and say you understand the cathedral.
The keystone is defined entirely by the pressure it exerts and receives from the stones around it. The concepts in Whitehead's philosophy lean on each other in exactly the same way.
The second pillar is logical. This operates exactly as one would expect. It is the strict necessity of lacking contradiction. The system must follow the rigorous principles of inference.
If the system produces 2 fundamental constructs that clash and contradict one another, it has failed the test of rationality.
Those first 2 represent the rational side. The empirical side begins with the third pillar, applicable. This means the philosophical scheme cannot just be a beautiful, mathematically perfect castle floating in the clouds.
It must touch the ground. It must provide an interpretation for some actual observable items of your real-world experience.
The fourth requirement is the most demanding of all. The system must be adequate. Adequacy means that the scheme must leave no item of experience incapable of interpretation.
It is not enough to perfectly explain the behavior of microscopic atoms if the system cannot also explain the subjective feeling of listening to a symphony, or the reality of a moral impulse, or the grief of losing a loved one.
The texture of observed experience must match the texture of the philosophical scheme entirely. But if language is as flawed and rigid as we discussed earlier, how does he even write this scheme?
In Section 2, he addresses this head-on. Because language evolved for the mundane sorting of everyday objects, it is fundamentally ill-equipped to express ultimate metaphysical truths.
To capture the actual dynamism of reality, words and phrases must be forcefully stretched beyond their ordinary usage. They must be utilized as metaphors, mutely appealing to an imaginative leap in the listener's mind.
This necessity for an imaginative leap is perfectly encapsulated in Whitehead's famous airplane metaphor, which describes the true method of philosophical discovery.
He states that the process of imaginative rationalization starts on the firm, unyielding ground of particular observation. We look closely at a specific phenomenon on the ground.
From that grounded observation, the mind, like an airplane, takes flight. It ascends into the thin, frictionless air of imaginative generalization.
Up there, in the realm of pure speculative thought, you are free from the messy, immediate details of the dirt. You connect dots, you trace vast patterns, you build a cohesive, logical system.
But the flight is completely useless if it never lands.
The airplane must eventually descend back to the ground for renewed observation. And the magic of this method is that when you land, your vision is rendered acute.
Equipped with the grand framework you built in the air, you look at the exact same patch of ground, but you suddenly see connections and realities that were completely invisible to you before you took flight.
This rhythmic method of taking flight and landing is exactly how Whitehead navigates the historical failures of philosophy. He contrasts the rigid, dogmatic empiricism that stubbornly refuses to ever leave the ground with the untethered rationalism that refuses to ever land.
We can see this tension clearly by looking at Descartes. Descartes observed the world and established a dualism, two distinct substances, mind and body.
But this system failed the test of coherence. He artificially disconnected his first principles, leaving mind and body with no logical way to interact. Why does this centuries-old philosophical failure matter to you today?
Because the way Descartes split the mind and the body is the exact reason modern medicine often treats your body like a biological machine while completely ignoring your mental health.
A flaw in philosophical coherence eventually becomes a flaw in how we live. Spinoza saw this incoherence in Descartes and tried to ground everything back into one unified system.
Spinoza proposed a pure monism, a single absolute substance that encompasses everything. But while Spinoza achieved coherence, he lost the dynamic, changing multiplicity of the real world.
Whitehead attempts to bridge this massive historical gap. He replaces Spinoza's single static absolute substance with an ultimate principle he simply calls creativity, which manifests dynamically through the endless multiplicity of individual actual entities.
To understand how past philosophers stumbled so badly, Whitehead warns us against a pervasive trap he calls the fallacy of misplaced concreteness.
This is the error of neglecting the degree of abstraction involved when we think about an entity. Think of an incredibly detailed topographical map of a mountain range.
The map is highly useful. It shows elevation, coordinate lines, and distances.
But the map is an abstraction. It completely ignores the biting cold of the wind, the smell of the pine trees, the shifting of the gravel under your boots. The fallacy of misplaced concreteness occurs when you study the map so intensely that you convince yourself the map is the mountain.
Modern science frequently commits this fallacy. It restricts its focus to a highly abstracted set of physical categories, like mass, velocity, and location, and then falsely concludes that anything outside those categories, like subjective experience or aesthetic value, simply doesn't exist.
But wait, isn't that abstraction exactly how science succeeds? I mean, if we don't abstract things, if we don't isolate variables, how can we even measure them or build technology?
Abstraction is incredibly useful, and Whitehead fully acknowledges that. The fallacy is not the act of abstracting. The fallacy is mistaking the abstraction for the concrete reality.
Because of this danger, Whitehead stresses that philosophical systems are not merely deductive mathematical proofs where you lock in a premise and blindly follow a chain of logic to an undeniable certainty.
Instead, a true philosophical scheme operates as a matrix. It is a structural framework of general ideas. You take that matrix and you boldly confront it with the stubborn facts of daily life.
If the matrix fails to eliminate those facts, it must be adjusted. Philosophy is a progressive, never-ending adventure of experimental clarification.
Which brings us to a stark realization about what philosophy actually is, as Whitehead draws a definitive line in Section 4. He notes that the field of a special science is safely and comfortably confined to one specific genus of facts.
A chemist restricts themselves purely to chemical reactions. They never have to make statements about facts that lie outside that extremely narrow domain. Science protects itself by ignoring the wider universe.
Philosophy possesses no such luxury. It is denied the comfort of a restricted focus. Philosophy is tasked with the impossible burden of viewing the totality of experience.
It must look at the exact same physical reality the chemist studies, but it must simultaneously account for the emotional intensity, the moral weight, and the perpetual perishing and becoming that define the entire cosmic epoch.
As we sit here in the quiet, absorbing the massive weight of this interconnected cosmology, considering the ceaseless rhythm of becoming and perishing, It forces a deeply intimate reflection upon your own immediate reality.
At this exact second, the subjective, private experience you are having is a living, actual entity. But in the next fraction of a moment, this experience will reach its satisfaction. It will perish.
It will immediately transition from a living feeling into an immortal, objective fact, permanently cemented into the history of the universe.
Which leaves you to wonder, as the boundary of the present pushes relentlessly forward, what exact shape, what specific emotional resonance your current entity is casting into the foundation of the reality that is just about to be born. And as we sit here, letting that initial framework settle in your mind, we can begin to truly feel the gravity of what the book is attempting.
It is heavy.
Yeah, it really is. You can sense how radical it is to completely abandon our old static view of the universe, to replace it instead with this vibrant, endlessly interconnected framework where reality itself is fundamentally defined as, well, as a process.
A continuous process.
Exactly. So our mission for this current stretch of our journey is to carefully, very deliberately unpack what the book calls the categorical scheme.
The foundation.
The absolute foundation. If we take our time with this, we're going to trace exactly how the author builds the universe from the ground up. I mean, it starts from the fragile limits of our own language and moves all the way into the very essence of how facts and forms collide in the dark.
And it requires a certain stillness, I think, to appreciate just how fragile those foundations really are.
But if the old scientific language is broken, as we established earlier, how does the author even begin to build a new one? Where is the starting line?
Well, the book directly challenges the scientific first principles that have been so comfortably handed down to us, especially those lingering from classical Newtonian physics.
The stuff we all just accept as reality.
Yes. And there is a quiet but profound warning here. Scientific principles often survive only by being heavily reinterpreted over generations.
The book uses a really beautiful, kind of melancholic image to describe this, doesn't it?
It does. The author says these earlier, broader generalities of science are eventually worn down like older hills.
Like older hills.
Just think of an ancient mountain range, diminished in height over millennia of wind and rain, until they are simply surpassed by younger, sharper rivals.
The younger peaks.
Exactly. That is what happens to our scientific dogmas.
Which means the tools we use to describe reality must also evolve.
They have to.
This brings us to the book's intense critique of language itself. I think a lot of people, myself included, might assume philosophy is just a matter of finding the right pre-existing words. You know, you just arrange the dictionary in a clever way.
That is the assumption, yeah. But the book insists that philosophy's actual job is to redesign language entirely.
Redesign it completely.
In the exact same way a physical science redesigns its instruments. I mean, a biologist wouldn't use a cloudy magnifying glass from the 16th century to study the inner workings of a cell today.
Right, that would be useless.
Similarly, the language of ordinary literature and our everyday verbal phrases, it simply breaks down when trying to express these massive, unprecedented philosophical generalities.
Because our daily language was built for survival.
Yes. For pointing at trees and asking for food, not for mapping the metaphysical architecture of the cosmos.
That makes sense in the abstract, but let's ground it for you listening. The book uses a phrase so common it feels beyond questioning. It looks at the proposition, Socrates is mortal.
The classic example.
Right. In our daily lives, if I say that to you, that phrase seems entirely self-sufficient. I know what I mean. You know what I mean.
It feels complete.
But the book claims that the word Socrates cannot stand alone. And when I first read that, I thought, hold on, what do you mean it can't stand alone? Why does the book claim I need a whole universe to justify that simple sentence?
It's a profound shift in perspective. The argument here is that to even utter the word Socrates with any actual meaning, you are unconsciously presupposing a completely systematic metaphysical universe.
You're dragging the whole universe into the room.
Exactly. Think about it. What is Socrates? He is a human, which presupposes biology, which presupposes a planet, space, time, mortality, history, and a specific set of physical laws that allow his body to exist and eventually fail.
He doesn't just exist in a vacuum.
No.
Yeah.
There is no such thing as a self-sustained fact floating in non-entity.
Floating in non-entity.
You cannot pluck Socrates out of the void. Every single definite entity requires a vast, systematic universe to supply its requisite status.
So if you pull a fact out of its systematic context in the actual world, if you sever its ties to everything else, it ceases to mean anything at all.
It becomes literal nonsense.
So if we can't isolate facts without destroying their meaning, How did philosophy get so far off track in trying to do exactly that?
The text points out that philosophy was essentially tricked.
Trick.
Tricked by the dazzling, undeniable success of mathematics.
Right.
Over the centuries, philosophy began copying mathematics, mistakenly adopting deduction as its primary standard method.
But deduction requires absolute isolated premises to start from.
Sterile axioms that you build upon.
And as we just established with Socrates, those isolated premises don't really exist in the messy reality of the actual universe.
They don't. Therefore, the book argues that philosophy's true, authentic method must be what it calls descriptive generalization.
Descriptive generalization. Let me see if I have this right. Instead of deducing from floating mathematical axioms, philosophy must look at the vast interwoven tapestry of human experience and attempt to generalize its patterns.
It has to describe what is actually happening.
And this approach completely reframes the relationship between our two great systems of thought, right? Religion and science.
It does. In this framework, religion and science are entirely distinct in the phases of experience they prioritize.
How so?
Science seeks harmony with the percepta, the objects themselves, the raw data forming the primary phase of experience.
So science looks at the objects themselves.
Yes. Religion, on the other hand, is centered upon finding a harmony of rational thought with our sensitive reactions.
Sensitive reactions.
It is deeply concerned with the experiencing subject, with you, the entity feeling the universe.
So to put it simply, using the rule we've been building, science is the fact. Religion is the feeling of the fact.
That's a perfect way to synthesize it.
Science conciliates thought with the primary matter, while religion conciliates thought with your sensitive reaction to that very same process.
Exactly. It's a beautiful way to divide the labor of human thought.
Now, to prevent us from falling back into our old habits of isolating facts, to prevent what the text calls the fallacy of misplaced concreteness, the book introduces 4 primary foundational notions.
The cornerstones.
Yeah, you can think of these as the 4 cornerstones of this newly designed language. The first are actual entities, which are sometimes called actual occasions.
And we really must linger on this concept, because it is the bedrock of everything that follows.
Let's take our time with it.
Actual entities are the final, irreducible, real things of which the world is made. There is no going behind them to find anything more real or more fundamental.
The ultimate building blocks.
But not blocks like bricks. The book describes them perfectly as drops of experience, complex and interdependent.
Drops of experience.
Imagine reality not as a solid block of matter, but as a continuous rain of these microscopic drops of experience.
It's a very vivid image.
And it is vital to note the book's radical consistency here. There is no exception to this rule.
None at all.
None. Even God in this philosophical system is considered an actual entity.
Wow. Okay, so if these drops of experience are the foundation, how do they interact? Because they can't just be falling through the void alone.
Right, which brings us to the second notion, prehensions.
Prehensions.
If actual entities are the drops of experience, prehensions are the concrete facts of relatedness between them. It is the mechanism of how one entity grasps or feels another.
Feeling as a physical reality.
Yes. The text describes a prehension as having a vector character. It isn't just a static link, it is directional.
Directional.
It carries emotion, purpose, valuation, and causation from an external world directly into the subjective formation of a new entity.
So it's a massive cosmic generalization of what Descartes called cogitations.
Or what John Locke simply called ideas. It is the universe feeling itself into existence.
And when those feelings weave together, we get the third notion, which is nexus.
Nexus.
Yeah.
Which serves as both the singular and plural form here.
And that is simply the togetherness of actual entities.
The intricate, localized web they form by prehending one another.
So you, me, the chair you were sitting on, the room around us, these are all highly complex nexus of actual entities.
Exactly.
Finally, the fourth pillar is the ontological principle.
This is the absolute unbreakable rule of this universe.
Let's hear it.
It states simply, no actual entity, then no reason.
No actual entity
We
that
cannot
sorry.
appeal to magical, floating forces or abstract laws that exist nowhere. Everything, every reason, every cause, every effect must be rooted somewhere in the concrete existence of a specific actual entity.
So if a concept or a cause isn't located in an actual entity.
It is a non-entity, it is nothing.
So we have these drops of experience, they are grasping each other, they are weaving together, and they are the only real things that exist.
That's the picture.
But what drives them? What is the engine making this happen? This brings us to the overarching triad known as the category of the ultimate. which involves three concepts: creativity, the many, and the one.
Let's slow down and look at how these three interact.
Okay.
Creativity is the universal of universals. It's the ultimate principle of novelty, the restless urge of the universe to generate something new.
The urge.
The many represents the disjunctive diversity of the universe, all the scattered, chaotic components, the raw data, and the past entities.
And the one.
The one is the singularity of a new, novel entity.
So if we put that in motion, creativity is the driving engine that forces the chaotic, disjunctive many to synthesize, to grow together, and become a novel one.
The book calls this process concrescence.
Concrescence. Think of concrescence like a drop of water freezing into an ice crystal in the upper atmosphere. It gathers all the chaotic loose elements and moisture around it, the many, and snaps them into a single brand new, rigid shape, the one.
The universe is driving itself forward in a constant, unstoppable creative advance, endlessly gathering the many to forge a new one.
Which then instantly becomes part of the many for the next creation.
Precisely. And as we descend from that ultimate engine of concrescence, the book outlines 8 categories of existence.
We won't list them all like an accountant's ledger, obviously.
Well, but we must feel the weight of their diverse layers. We have the actual entities, the prehensions, and the nexus we just explored.
Yeah.
But the book also heavily emphasizes something called eternal objects.
Eternal objects,
Yeah.
which are pure potentials. What exactly does it mean by a pure potential?
Think of the forms of definiteness, a specific shade of emerald green, or the mathematical concept of a perfect triangle.
Okay, I can picture that.
That shade of green does not exist in time by itself. It isn't floating in space waiting to be found, but it has the potential to ingress or enter into actual entities.
Giving them their specific recognizable character.
Yes.
Yeah.
A leaf prehends the eternal object of greenness to become a green leaf.
And as the book moves into the 27 categories of explanation, it does something fiercely vital. It completely, utterly rejects a concept known as vacuous actuality.
A haunting idea.
It really is. It has plagued realistic philosophy for centuries. It is the notion of a reality made of empty, dead matter, a universe of mechanical substances completely devoid of what the book calls subjective immediacy.
The text insists with absolute conviction that the idea of dead matter is false.
There is no dead stuff.
None. Every actual entity is a subject experiencing its own self-formation.
However, that subjective immediacy, that spark of present feeling, it does not last forever.
No. The author breathes new life into the ancient philosophical doctrine that no one crosses the same river twice.
Because the river is constantly flowing, constantly changing.
It is never the exact same river from moment to moment.
In this philosophy of organism, actual entities perpetually perish.
Perpetual perishing.
It's a beautiful, tragic phrase.
It is the heartbeat of this universe. An actual entity flashes into existence. It achieves its subjective satisfaction. It finishes freezing into that ice crystal, to use your metaphor, and in that exact microscopic fraction of a moment of completion, its subjective immediacy extinguishes.
It perishes.
It ceases to feel. But in perishing, it acquires objective immortality.
Objective immortality, meaning it goes from being a private feeling subject to being a stubborn public fact.
It becomes a datum in the universe that must now be prehended by the very next wave of becoming.
To govern exactly how an entity manages this brief, microscopic flash of self-formation before it perishes, the book quietly lays out 9 categorical obligations.
The inner inescapable rules of becoming.
Think of them as the psychological laws of a drop of experience.
Right. For instance, the category of subjective unity demands that the many chaotic feelings within a developing entity must ultimately be compatible.
You can't build a unified self out of total contradiction.
The entity must reconcile its feelings. And then the category of objective identity ensures that an element in the universe plays one self-consistent role within a specific entity's satisfaction.
And there is also conceptual reversion.
A fascinating one.
It introduces secondary, novel conceptual feelings. If an entity feels a certain data point, conceptual reversion allows it to also feel the opposite or the alternative of that data point.
This is the mechanism that allows for true imaginative leaps.
And the text makes a stunning claim here. It says formal logic itself, everything we study in textbooks about deduction and reason, is nothing more than the general abstract analysis of this very self-consistency demanded by these microscopic obligations.
But all of this creative advance, this ceaseless, dizzying, perishing, and becoming, it requires a stabilizing force.
Otherwise, if the universe is just a storm of microscopic drops flashing in and out of existence, why isn't it just pure chaos?
Exactly. Which brings us to the primordial nature of God.
And we should clarify, the text describes this not in the traditional religious sense of a creator before time who built the world like a clock.
No, rather is the unconditioned conceptual valuation of all eternal objects.
Let me try to visualize that. It is a divine ordering of all those pure potentials we talked about. Every shade of green, every mathematical shape, every possible configuration of feeling.
By valuing these potentials, the primordial nature of God provides relevance to the temporal world.
Because without this divine ordering, the realm of pure potential would be a barren, inefficient disjunction.
It would be an infinite menu with no recommendations.
An infinite menu with no recommendations.
God provides the initial lure, the relevant target for the temporal world's creative advance.
Coaxing the universe toward deeper complexity and harmony.
God holds out the highest possible potential for every specific occasion.
And how does the temporal world, how do actual entities respond to that lure?
Through a concept called appetition.
Appetition. The book defines appetition as an urge towards the future based upon an appetite in the present moment.
It is how an entity reaches out for a potential that is not yet physically realized.
The analogy the author uses to ground this abstract idea is profoundly relatable. I want you listening to just sit quietly with this feeling for a moment. Think about the physical sensation of thirst.
A very primal feeling.
Thirst is not just an empty void. It is an immediate, often painful physical feeling in your throat and your body. But deeply integrated within that physical lack is a conceptual prehension.
A mental grasp.
A conceptual prehension of quenching that thirst. So you feel the dry throat, which is a physical fact, but you also conceptually grasp the unrealized form of relief, the cool water that isn't actually there yet.
Precisely. Thirst is directed towards a difference.
A difference.
It is directed towards something relevant, something deeply desired, but something not yet present in the actual world.
And this, the text argues, is the lowest level germ of a free imagination.
It is the beginning of the universe, dreaming of what could be, projecting a future state to solve a present deficit.
As these microscopic entities dream and grasp and become, they obviously don't do it alone, which is why we have chairs and trees and people. They group together into what the text calls a society.
A society.
Now, a society in this specific vocabulary is just a nexus of actual entities that possess a social order and a defining characteristic that they all share and inherit from one another.
And we can contrast two very different types of societies to understand how reality is structured.
A corpuscular society and a non-corpuscular society.
Right. A corpuscular society is what you would think of as an ordinary physical object that endures over time. Think of a stone or a tree.
It has thick strands of personal order holding it together.
But a non-corpuscular society doesn't have those enduring personal strands.
Think of a wave of light.
Yes, propagating its defining characteristic from atomic creature to atomic creature across the vast vacuum of space. It is a society of energy moving through the dark.
That phrase you just used, atomic creature, is the key to the book's entire stance on time and space. I think instinctively, if you ask anyone on the street, we feel that time flows continuously.
We picture it like a smooth, unbroken line drawn on a page.
But the book argues that becoming itself is not continuous, it is atomic. Actual entities are discrete, separate drops of experience.
To prove this mathematically and logically, the text invokes Zeno's ancient philosophical method, specifically his paradoxes of motion.
Let's look at the paradox of the flying arrow.
If you assume time and space are perfectly infinitely continuous, then at any given infinitely small instant of time, an arrow in flight must occupy a space exactly equal to its length.
That makes logical sense.
But if it occupies exactly its own length at an instant, it is by definition at rest in that instant.
Right.
And if time is just an infinite series of these static instants, the arrow can never actually move. Motion becomes impossible.
It traps you in an inescapable paradox.
Exactly. To break the paradox, the author concludes that continuity is not a necessity of becoming. Becoming is discrete.
The arrow doesn't glide continuously.
No, it blinks into existence, perishes,
Yeah.
and the next actual occasion in the historic ride of the arrow blinks into existence slightly further along the path.
So the continuous, extensive nature of space and time as we perceive it is actually a specific creation of our present cosmic epoch.
It is a macro illusion built out of the relations of these discrete atomic occasions.
Which leads us to the monumental weight of how these atomic occasions actually solidify. The book makes a very famous assertion here, one that echoes through the halls of thought.
It says the safest general characterization of the European philosophical tradition is that it consists of a series of footnotes to Plato.
Footnotes to Plato. The author is specifically invoking Plato's idea that there is always a factor of the simply given or brute fact that cannot be explained away by pure rational law.
There is an irreducible stubbornness to reality.
And that brute fact is established through those prehensions we talked about, which are fundamentally divided into positive and negative.
A positive prehension, which the text simply calls a feeling, is the definite inclusion of an item from the surrounding universe into the subject's own internal constitution.
You take it in, and it becomes part of you.
But the negative prehension is equally critical, isn't it?
It is arguably more critical. A negative prehension is the definite exclusion of an item from positive contribution.
You look at a chaotic room and focus only on the book in front of you. You negatively prehend the rest of the noise.
Yet, by excluding it, that negative prehension still uniquely shapes the emotional complex of the entity. You are defined just as much by what you permanently shut out of your experience as by what you let in.
This brings us to the heavy, silent core of the book's metaphysics, the profound concepts of givenness, potentiality, and decision.
The text states that actuality is a decision amid potentiality. Just let that sink in for a second. In the infinite sea of what could be, an actual entity must choose what it will be.
It must positively include, and it must negatively exclude.
It cuts off the other possibilities. As the author dramatically notes, rooted in the Latin root of the word decision, which literally means a cutting off, once a decision is made, the rest is silence.
It becomes a stubborn fact which cannot be evaded by the future.
The book illustrates this immense weight of decision with striking physical examples. Consider the Castle Rock at Edinburgh.
A beautiful example.
Imagine this massive volcanic stone structure sitting there. Immense, weathered, and seemingly permanent.
But the text asks you to see it completely differently.
The Castle Rock does not just passively exist.
No, it exists from moment to moment entirely by reason of the microscopic decisions affected by its historic route of antecedent occasions.
Every fraction of a second, the billions of entities composing that rock are making a localized decision to inherit their past and sustain its defining characteristic as a rock.
It is a frenzied society of continuous decision.
And if, in some vast upheaval of nature, an earthquake were to strike and the rock were to shatter into fragments, that convulsion, that violent destruction, would itself be a definitive decision.
It would be a cutting off of the rock's historic route, a brute fact that fundamentally conditions the entire future of the universe.
Or consider the text critique of older metaphysical examples. It mentions Francis Herbert Bradley's doctrine.
The idea that something like a wolf eating a lamb is merely a universal concept qualifying the grand absolute.
The book violently rejects this sort of airy abstraction. It states clearly, that specific wolf ate that specific lamb at that specific spot in the forest at that exact time.
The wolf knew it, the lamb knew it in terror, and the carrion birds waiting in the trees knew it.
The universe is built out of these highly specific, completely unavoidable decisions, not vague, floating universals.
This realization completely blurs the sharp, traditional distinction we've all been taught to make between universals and particulars.
How does the author frame that?
He argues that every universal acts as a particular because it only truly matters in how it enters into the description of a specific, particular, actual entity.
So the color gray only matters when it is the gray of that specific wolf's fur.
Exactly. Conversely, every particular entity acts universally, because once it achieves its satisfaction and perishes, it enters into the description of the entire future universe.
It becomes a permanent part of the cosmic data. The absolute divide collapses.
To truly feel how this changes our daily perception, the text guides us back to a famous moment from René Descartes' writings.
Descartes describes looking out a window down into a winter street and seeing men walking by in hats and coats.
But Descartes catches his own logic.
We effortlessly say, I see men.
But technically, strictly speaking, from the visual data alone, we do not see men. We only see hats and coats moving through the street.
Those heavy winter garments could very well be covering automatic machines made of springs and pulleys.
We don't just objectively see men. We synthetically judge them to be men, based on a massive complex of past data and present expectation.
And that is the perfect encapsulation of how we comprehend the nature of actual things in this philosophy. Our experience is not a passive mirror reflecting a static world.
It is a highly active, complex concrescence,
We are taking the myriad disjunctive data of our physical feelings, the colors, the shapes, the hats, the coats, and integrating them with our conceptual prehensions.
executing a final binding decision to experience a unified reality.
We are constantly deciding the universe into focus.
We really are.
Which brings us to a profound reflection. If every single microscopic moment of our existence, exactly like the imposing weight of the Castle Rock at Edinburgh, is a culmination of decisions that definitively, irreversibly cut off all other hovering potentials.
The rest is silence.
If actuality is nothing but this stubborn, unavoidable fact of decision where the rest is silence, how does that change the way you experience the quiet, seemingly mundane seconds of your own life? So stepping right back into the pages of this book, we find ourselves immediately surrounded by...
By that really breathtaking architecture of the philosophy of the organism.
Right, exactly.
Oh, yeah.
We're drawn straight back into a worldview where the universe is, well, it's absolutely not made of dead, static stuff. It's an intensely alive, interconnected web of events and processes.
Everything is happening.
Yes, everything is a continuous unfolding.
It really is a profound shift in how we are asked to perceive reality. But to truly grasp the magnitude of this philosophy, the book forces us to bravely confront the ghosts of 17th and 18th century philosophy.
Oh, we really have to look closely at the foundational thoughts of, well, Descartes, Hume, Locke, Aristotle, and Newton.
Exactly. The author carefully shows us how these brilliant minds fundamentally misunderstood the nature of reality by clinging so fiercely to the idea of an isolated substance. They were completely trapped by what the book calls the subject-predicate dogma.
I really want to unpack that subject-predicate dogma because it's such a fascinating trap to fall into. It goes all the way back to this old Aristotelian idea that a substance is something that exists entirely on its own.
It requires nothing but itself to exist.
Right. It's the belief that a thing simply possesses qualities, the predicate, and it requires absolutely nothing else. Descartes famously defined substance in exactly this way. He basically painted a picture of a universe filled with disconnected things just floating around.
Which made a lot of sense for early modern science. I mean, if
Yeah.
you want to measure something, you want to isolate it. But the philosophy of the organism completely rejects this old definition for how reality actually operates.
It violently rejects it.
Yeah, it does. The book replaces it with this concept of universal relativity. And to be clear, we aren't talking about Einstein's relativity of physics here. It's a metaphysical relativity. It asserts that every actual entity is present in every other actual entity.
Nothing exists in a vacuum.
Exactly nothing. To be an entity is to be internally related to the entire rest of the universe.
I love how we can visualize this. If you think about the old Aristotelian and Cartesian view, you can imagine reality as a bucket of isolated marbles. They might bump into each other in the bucket, but they are entirely closed off, smooth and solitary.
They never truly interact internally.
Right, they don't. But the view in this book aligns with what William James so beautifully called the buzzing world. Imagine, instead of isolated marbles, a massive, infinitely complex, vibrating spider web.
If you pluck just one single microscopic string on that web, the vibration reverberates through the entire structure.
The entire web feels the pluck.
That's a magnificent image. And what's so compelling is how the book points out that John Locke almost figured this out centuries ago. In his essay concerning human understanding, Locke came incredibly close to formulating an organic philosophy.
He introduced the concept of power, right?
Yes, he did. But he tragically fell back on the old habits of that isolated marble mindset. This book, however, rescues Locke's concept of power and repurposes it. Power is no longer just an abstract capability, it's the very real physical transmission of how one entity passes its energy, its actual constitution, to the next entity.
Okay, so if we are tossing out Locke's outdated concepts of isolated ideas, what are we replacing them with? How do things actually connect and transmit power in this buzzing web?
This is where we have to talk about prehensions and objectification. These terms are really the bedrock of the entire philosophy. The book discards the word idea because it implies a purely mental conscious phenomenon happening inside a human brain.
Right, it's too tied to consciousness.
Exactly. Instead, it uses prehension. Think of prehension as a complete transaction. It is the physical act of one entity absorbing another entity into its own constitution. And this absorption happens through what the book calls feeling.
We should probably pause on that word feeling because it sounds like we're saying atoms have emotions. The book isn't using feeling to describe being happy or sad, right?
Not at all. It's using feeling as a physical foundational absorption of the past. To feel in this philosophical sense is to incorporate the objective reality of the past into the subjective reality of the present.
It's the way the universe literally takes hold of itself.
That's a perfect way to phrase it.
The analogy that always helps me ground this is how a tree absorbs sunlight and water. The tree isn't just observing the sun from a distance in some detached Cartesian way.
No, it's actively pulling it in.
The sun literally becomes part of the tree's internal constitution. The photons travel across the solar system, they hit the leaf, and through photosynthesis, that solar energy is physically prehended. It is objectified into the living tissue of the organism.
The tree feels the sun by becoming one with its energy.
Yes, exactly. This is how actual entities feel the universe.
Which leads to one of the most haunting concepts in the entire text, perpetual perishing. An actual entity exists in its moment of subjective private creation. But the very nature of time means that this moment cannot last.
It has to end.
It does. The entity achieves what the book calls satisfaction, a completion of its process, and the exact moment it does, it perishes as a subject. But in perishing, it achieves objective immortality.
It becomes an object.
A stubborn fact in the universe, ready to be prehended by the very next generation of actual entities.
It's a breathtaking cycle. We are constantly perishing, and in that perishing, we are gifting our reality to the future. But this raises a really fascinating question. If everything is just this buzzing web of fleeting moments perishing into the next keep, how do we actually perceive the world right in front of us?
How do you look at a room and see solid walls and furniture?
Exactly. The book unpacks this using a term called presentational immediacy.
Presentational immediacy is our clear, distinct consciousness of the spatial world right in front of us. It's the vividness of colors, sounds, and geometrical shapes. But the book offers a profound warning here. Our direct perception through our senses creates an illusion.
It flattens reality.
It entirely flattens the wildly complex historical contemporary world into pure extension.
Right. Our eyes and ears give us a flat mathematical map of the world clothed in sense data. And the book walks us through specific grades of how our senses trick us. Grades of what it calls delusiveness.
Let's talk about those grades because they ground the theory so well.
So think about sitting in a room right now. If you're looking at a solid wooden chair right in front of you that is a non-delusive perception, the visual image you see is correctly grounded in the actual historical route of the physical entities making up that chair.
But then consider a partially delusive perception. Imagine you're looking at that exact same chair, but you're seeing its reflection in a mirror. You see the chair, the spatial geometry is there, the colors are there, but the actual historical society of entities, the atoms, is not located where the mirror tells you it is.
The physical history has been bent by the glass.
Yes, your senses are partially tricking you about where the universe actually is.
And then we reach the highly delusive grade. Imagine you're experiencing a vivid hallucination. You see a chair perfectly clearly in your presentational immediacy. But when you hallucinate a chair, there isn't actually a physical history there.
The book says there's no corpuscular society of entities, which is just a fancy way of saying there are no actual atoms, no wood, no physical building blocks grouping together over time to make that chair real in the physical world.
Your senses are completely divorcing the geometry from the actual history of the universe.
This is exactly why the book places such massive importance on the withness of the body. Descartes tried to separate the mind from the body, entirely treating the mind as an unextended thinking thing, and the body as mere mechanical gears.
But the philosophy of the organism insists that we perceive the world with our bodies. We don't just see, we see with our eyes. We don't just touch, we touch with our hands.
This subtle linguistic shift is actually a colossal metaphysical anchor.
It grounds us completely. The body is our primary instrument of prehension. It's the most intimately relevant part of our antecedent settled world. And as we consider how our bodies move through this world, we have to look at the space and time we are moving through.
We absolutely do. The book introduces this mind-bending concept called the epochal theory of time. It tells us that this extensive continuum, this vast geometry of space and time, is just bare potential. It isn't actually real until it is atomized by actual entities.
We really need to unwrap this carefully because we're so used to thinking of time as a smooth, perfectly continuous, infinitely divisible river.
And space, too, is something you can just keep cutting in half forever with a geometric knife. The book agrees that the potentiality of space and time is infinitely divisible, but the actual process of becoming is incurably atomic.
So the potential is continuous, but the actuality is atomic. A great way to visualize this is to think of a vintage film projector. If you look at the movie playing on the screen, the motion seems perfectly smoothen, fluid, and continuous.
But if you walk up to the projector and look at the physical film strip itself,
You see, it's made up of distinct individual atomic frames. Time doesn't flow smoothly, as William James said. It grows in buds or drops of perception. It ticks forward, frame by frame.
and realizing that reality comes in these atomic frames completely solves Zeno's ancient paradoxes, which have haunted mathematics and philosophy for millennia. Consider Zeno's paradox of the arrow in its flight.
Zeno argued that at any given indivisible instant of time, the flying area is occupying a space equal to itself. So in that frozen instant, it must be at rest.
And if time is just an infinite series of these zero-duration instants, motion is impossible. It's an illusion.
Or the famous Achilles and the tortoise paradox. It's like trying to walk to the fridge for a midnight snack, but Zeno's math tells you that you first have to cover half the distance, then half of the remaining distance, then half of that into infinity.
You'd literally starve to death before reaching the door handle.
Because you're stuck in an infinite mathematical loop, Zeno's math essentially freezes the universe by infinitely dividing it.
But the book uses simple arithmetic and the reality of atomic becoming to prove Zeno's mathematical fallacy. The premise that an act of becoming can be chopped in half infinitely is simply false.
The book states that while you can mathematically divide the measure of time infinitely on a piece of paper, you cannot divide the act of becoming.
An actual occasion happens as one solid drop of time. It comes into existence as a whole frame. You cannot have half of a moment of becoming. Because it's a solid drop, the infinite series of subdivisions never actually occurs in the physical process of reality.
The paradox vanishes when you realize that actuality atomizes the continuum. It's so incredibly satisfying to see an ancient mathematical trap dismantled by just having a better understanding of how reality actually grows.
And speaking of ancient traps, the book takes us directly into a battle with Isaac Newton. Newton gave us the famous Scholium in his Principia, where he laid out his view of absolute space and absolute time.
Newton viewed space and time as a giant receptacle. The receptacle theory is such a pervasive way of thinking even today.
He pictured space as a giant, infinite empty box, and time as a perfectly steady ticking clock that exists entirely independent of anything else. In Newton's mind, things just happen to move inside this pre-existing empty box.
Space and time are absolute, and material objects are just placed into them like furniture into a room.
The organic rejection of this is total. The philosophy of the organism tells us that space and time do not exist on their own as empty containers. They are not independent realities waiting to be filled.
Space and time are simply the relationships built by actual occasions. If there were no actual entities prehending each other, there would be no space and no time. They are the relational fabric woven by the events of the universe themselves.
This fundamentally alters how we look at everything, even something as incredibly mundane as a stone resting on the ground. Newton and, frankly, centuries of common sense looked at a stone and saw undifferentiated endurance.
They believed it was a single dead substance that just sits there, remaining perfectly identical to itself from one second to the next, enduring through the empty receptacle of time.
But the book provides a brilliant scientific critique of that simple stone. It points out that modern physics, the discovery of protons, electrons, and the quanta of energy, completely destroys the idea of undifferentiated endurance.
That stone is not a dead, static lump. It is a wildly active society of vibrations and rhythms. It's an incomprehensibly vast collection of microscopic events constantly happening and renewing themselves.
The book beautifully calls these atomic movements locomotive adventures.
Locomotive adventures is such a great phrase. The stone is an enduring society of these adventures constantly recreating itself, drop by drop, epoch by epoch.
And this realization that every seemingly solid thing is actually a society of pulsating events forces us to ask a massive question about the order of nature.
If the universe isn't a static box of dead matter, but a buzzing, atomized web of perpetual perishing and becoming, why isn't it just pure, unadulterated chaos?
It's the ultimate question, right? Why do we have a stable universe? Why do we have laws of physics or biology or human thought instead of just random chaotic noise?
The book answers this by explaining 4 grounds of order, and it does so by looking at how a single event actually comes together.
To understand this order, we have to look at how an entity creates itself. The universe doesn't just passively accept the massive chaotic pile of data from the past. Instead, it actively selects against chaos.
It takes the stubborn reality it's given and introduces an adaptation for the attainment of a specific end. That active selection is the foundation of order.
And as it's selecting from the past, It's concerned with building gradations of intensity. When an entity gathers all these past feelings, it doesn't treat everything equally.
It prioritizes certain prehensions over others, bringing the important stuff to the foreground and pushing the irrelevant noise to the background, building an intense core of experience.
Which leads to a really profound secret of how the universe operates. When an entity brings together completely different aspects of the past, instead of letting them clash and cancel each other out in a chaotic mess, it harmonizes them into a contrast.
Contrasts heighten intensity without becoming incompatible. Think of a beautiful painting. It isn't a muddy puddle of mixed paint. It's a careful contrast of different colors brought together to heighten the overall visual impact.
A symphony does the exact same thing with contrasting sounds.
Hmm.
The universe creates order by turning difference into harmonious intensity.
And guiding all of this is an inherent appetition. This intensity in the subject involves an appetite, an objective functioning aimed at its future as a superject. It desires an ideal.
And this entire process of gathering, sorting, contrasting, and aiming toward an ideal culminates in what the book defines as satisfaction and concrescence.
We should define those terms clearly. Concrescence literally means growing together. It's the process of the entity forming itself.
And satisfaction in this philosophical context has nothing to do with human happiness or eating a good meal. Satisfaction is the final, ultimate attainment of a specific, determinate completion.
It's the absolute end of the concrescence. The entity has taken the buzzing world, harmonized the contrasts, achieved its specific intensity, and reached its finalized state.
And the tragic poetry of this entire system is that the exact microsecond it achieves satisfaction, it perishes. Its life as an experiencing subject is over, and it instantly becomes an immortal object for the rest of the universe to use.
But what is actually guiding this process from the start? What stops it from just blindly grouping things together? This is where the book introduces the subjective aim, which acts as a lure for feeling.
The subjective aim is essentially the inner compass of the event. It's the ideal of what that entity could become, hovering just in front of it, drawing it forward. The lure for feeling is a conceptual possibility that provokes the physical realization.
The book uses David Hume's own famous philosophical puzzle to prove this point beautifully. Hume was an absolute empiricist. He firmly believed that all our ideas must come from a prior physical impression. You can't have an idea of an apple if you've never seen or tasted one.
But Hume himself admitted one glaring exception to his own rule: the missing shade of blue.
Yes, the missing shade of blue is a brilliant crack in pure empiricism. Hume noted that if you were presented with a gradient of every single shade of blue imaginable, arranged perfectly from dark to light, but with one specific shade intentionally removed from the middle, your mind could easily imagine that missing shade.
Even though your eyes had never physically seen it, your mind supplies the gap.
And the book seizes on this admission. It uses Hume's missing shade of blue to prove that a conceptual lure can and does exist before the physical feeling.
The universe provides the ideal, the missing shade, to lure the actual entity toward a novel creation. The possibility actively draws the reality forward.
And this requires us to look at how the book conceptualizes God. In this philosophy, God is not presented as a traditional imperial creator standing outside the receptacle of time, dictating laws to the physical matter.
Instead, in God's primordial nature, God is the ultimate organ of novelty. God holds all pure possibilities, all eternal objects, and gently provides these conceptual lures to the universe.
God is the source of the missing shade of blue, pointing every actual entity toward an ideal, inviting the universe to increase its intensity and its harmony.
It's just a staggering vision of reality. And as we draw these immense cosmic threads together, it fundamentally redefines your very own existence.
According to the pages we've just explored, your reality, you listening to this right now, possesses a profound threefold character. First, you are given by your past. The entire history of the universe has flowed into your physical body to create the absolute unchangeable foundation of your present moment.
Second, you are in this very microsecond actively creating your subjective present using your subjective aim to harmoniously synthesize that past.
And third, you will instantly become a superject, a permanent immortal value, qualifying the future, an indestructible fact that the rest of eternity must reckon with.
And as you contemplate that staggering weight of your own objective immortality, you must look closely at the precise mechanism of your own consciousness and ask yourself how your current drop of experience is right now perishing to become the foundation for the very next moment. Which is exactly why returning to this text feels so profoundly grounding right now.
It really does. It has a gravity to it.
Yeah, and as we step into part 4 of our continuous 10-part journey through this incredibly complex book, I think it is worth pausing for just a moment to reorient ourselves.
To zoom out and look at the overarching vision.
Right, exactly. Because we are looking at a foundational text in the philosophy of organism,
Right.
which is a perspective that radically redefines the universe. It asks you to stop seeing reality as a collection of dead, static objects just bumping into each other in a void.
And instead to understand it as a living, dynamic web of interconnected events.
Yes, interconnected events and processes. Everything is becoming. Everything is an event. And picking up right where we left off, there is a fascinating early concept here that completely reframes modern philosophy, the total inversion of Immanuel Kant.
Precisely. That inversion is the hinge upon which this entire cosmology swings.
Because I always learned that Kant famously argued that the subjective mind shapes the objective world. That we impose space and time and our own mental categories onto the raw data of reality.
Right, but this book argues the exact opposite. The subject emerges from the world. We are not isolated, fully formed minds looking out through the windows of our eyes at a detached universe.
We are localized focal points.
Think of yourself as a specific coordinate where the entire history of the universe converges and synthesizes into a single momentary droplet of experience.
A droplet of experience. I love that phrasing.
And the book uses the term subjective satisfaction to describe this completion of a moment. The objective data, the physical environment around you, the light hitting your retina, the heritage of the cosmos, these are all potentials for feeling. The very process of existing is taking all that objective data and synthesizing it into a unique subjective unity.
You are the universe, momentarily organized into a perspective. So, my conscious experience right now isn't something separate from the room I'm sitting in. My experience is the room, and the whole universe behind it, finally reaching a state of satisfaction within my specific perspective. That completely changes how you view your own existence.
It does.
And it leads to a definition of God in this book that is unlike anything you will find in traditional theology.
It is very far removed from the image of a purely transcendent creator sitting outside of time, orchestrating the universe like a cosmic clockmaker.
Right. God is described instead as the outcome of creativity, the foundation of order, and perhaps, most intriguingly, the goad towards novelty.
It is an entirely restless vision of the divine. God is not an exception to the metaphysical rules of the universe, but rather their chief exemplification.
And within this system, God has two natures.
Yes, the primordial nature is the eternal conceptual realization of all possibilities, every potential shape, feeling, and outcome that could ever exist.
But it is the consequent nature that actually drives the physical world.
Exactly. God directs the universe not by brute force or decree, but by providing a lure for feeling. God is that goad towards novelty because the ultimate aim of the universe is not to preserve things forever in some static, unchanging perfection.
The aim is the evocation of intensity.
Depth of satisfaction, rich contrasts, and harmonious complexity. Mere preservation is secondary. Intensity of experience is primary. Every actual entity is pushed toward ever greater aesthetic and experiential intensity.
So if the overarching goal is this pursuit of intensity, how do things actually group together to achieve it? Because the book introduces the concept of a society, and I want to make sure I'm wrapping my head around it.
Well, in this context, it has absolutely nothing to do with human cities or sociology.
Right, it describes a society as a self-sustaining group of actual entities that share a defining characteristic.
A society, as the term is used here, is a nexus, a linked network of actual entities that are ordered among themselves. It is self-sustaining, meaning it is its own reason for existing.
And to constitute a society, the members must share a common character and impose the conditions that lead to that likeness onto the future members through genetic derivation.
A very clear, if unexpected, example provided is a human being. A single human life is described as a historic route of actual occasions.
So if you possess the knowledge of the Greek language, that knowledge is a common characteristic inherited from one momentary occasion of your existence to the next.
Yes, it traces a route from the moment you acquired that language until the moment you lose it or pass away. That historic route constitutes a society in reference to the knowledge of Greek.
Your very identity, your persistence as a person over time, is essentially a society of sequential moments passing the baton of your characteristics forward.
Precisely.
So I am a society of moments. But obviously, I do not exist in a vacuum. If I am passing these traits forward, how does the surrounding environment factor into this? The book mentions that every society requires a supportive background.
Reality is deeply layered in this philosophy. Every society requires a wider social background, which contributes the foundational rules to which the members of that society must conform.
If you widen the lens far enough, beyond your immediate environment, beyond the Earth, you reach the concept of cosmic epochs.
Our current reality is referred to as the electromagnetic epoch. This epoch is defined by the pervasive presence of electrons and protons.
The physical laws we rely on, like Maxwell's equations, hold sway because of the massive throngs of these specific entities.
Every electron is itself a tiny society of electronic occasions. But here's the profound takeaway. These laws of nature aren't absolute, eternal decrees handed down from on high.
They are merely the dominant habits of the most widespread society in our current epoch.
There is always a degree of disorder, tiny instances of failure and reproduction, which allows for the gradual transition to new types of order, and eventually new laws of nature supervening upon the old ones.
Which brings us to a historical comparison in the book that completely caught me off guard. It pits Plato against Newton.
Specifically, Plato's ancient mythological text, the Timaeus, against Newton's highly mathematical Scholium.
To anyone raised on modern science, it seems obvious that Newton's precise model of physics is superior to Plato's allegories about cosmic craftsmen. But the book actually praises Plato and heavily critiques Newton. Why does this philosophy prefer Plato over the father of modern physics?
It comes down to how we construct our fundamental models of reality. Newton's Scholium is brilliant in its practical, superficial detail, but conceptually it commits what this philosophy calls the fallacy of misplaced concreteness.
Confusing abstract models with reality.
Exactly. Newton views space, time, and material masses as completely ready-made and independent. Matter is just dead stuff pushed around by external forces in an absolute empty container of space.
That framework leaves no room for the internal generation of nature, for evolution, or for how things actually come to be.
Newton's universe is externally designed and entirely obedient. Plato, on the other hand, attempts to connect the behavior of things with their formal, fundamental nature.
In the Timaeus, Plato understood that the actual world is an incoming of forms into real potentiality.
He anticipated the idea that different kinds of natural things, like different molecules or elements, derive their sharp-cut differences from geometric and mathematical forms interacting with a receptive background.
It is almost like Newton gives us a universe of billiard balls, whereas Plato is describing something much closer to modern quantum mechanics.
The book notes that Newton would have been entirely confused by quantum theory, with its dissolving of solid matter into vibrations and probabilities, whereas Plato would have expected it.
Newton's framework gives us no hint as to why there are specific atomic possibilities or limited ways atoms can combine. It just takes dead matter as a given.
Plato, despite the mythological language of his time, was searching for the why behind the what. He was looking for the qualitative contrasts and harmonic ratios that define reality. He saw an aboriginal disorder being shaped into a specific type of cosmic order.
The philosophy of organism aligns itself with Plato's metaphysical depth because it treats the universe as a process of becoming rather than a static container of dead objects.
Yes.
So if the universe favors Plato's dynamic forms over Newton's dead matter, how does that actually look in reality? How does dead matter wake up and become alive? Because the transition from the inorganic to the living is described as a bid for freedom.
Life introduces conceptual novelty to escape the rigid inheritance of its ancestors.
Consider a complex, inorganic structured society, like a quartz crystal or a piece of granite.
It achieves stability by eliminating diversity of detail. It survives by blocking out unwelcome data from the environment to maintain a massive, unyielding average state.
That is the first mode of solving the problem of survival in a chaotic universe, simply enduring by resisting change.
But the second mode is what we call living. Instead of blocking out novelty, a living society actively initiates conceptual prehensions. It seeks out the novel elements in its environment and integrates them.
Conceptual prehensions. That is a heavy phrase. Are we just talking about an organism's ability to grasp or feel a new possibility that isn't physically present yet?
That is a perfect way to translate it. A physical pretension is grasping what is already there, the past. A conceptual prehension is grasping a potential, a could-be.
This conceptual initiative is a reaction that transcends mere physical inheritance.
An organism is alive when its subjective aim introduces a novelty of definiteness that was not found in the inherited data. Life alters the values of the inherited world. It takes what is given and imagines a new configuration.
And the imagery used to describe where this life physically resides is incredibly vivid. The book says that life actually lurks in the interstices, the empty spaces within a cell or a brain. It's not in the solid, occupied matter itself.
The highly complex inorganic structures of a living body, the intricate folding of proteins, the complex molecules, are woven together not to be the life, but to provide a highly poised, unstable chemical environment.
The life itself, the entirely living nexus, exists in the interstitial empty space between those structures.
Because the surrounding physical architecture is so phenomenally complex, the data transmitted into those empty spaces escapes the normal statistical physical laws that hold for a simple rock.
The statistical balance is disturbed.
This allows for an enormous variety of physical experience to pool in those microscopic empty spaces, requiring a novel conceptual prehension, a spark of originality, to organize it.
The body provides the protective complex labyrinth. The empty space is where the life flares up to integrate that overwhelming complexity.
But to sustain that highly complex, unstable physical labyrinth, the organism has to do something quite brutal. The book states bluntly, life is robbery.
Living societies must destroy and dissolve other societies' food to survive. They rob other structures of their complexity to maintain their own.
In the inorganic world, a crystal can sit under a glass case in a museum forever, largely independent of its environment. But a living society requires constant interplay.
It must digest, which inherently means to disintegrate.
A living thing breaks down the complex social elements of its food, dissolving the intricate proteins of a plant or another animal into simpler building blocks to fuel its own ongoing existence.
Whether we view it as gentle or harsh, life is an act of energetic theft.
But returning to our earlier discussion of the universe's purpose, this robbery requires a philosophical justification. And that justification is found in the fact that the primordial aim of the cosmos is seeking intensity, not preservation.
The destruction of lower-grade societies to fuel the intense, highly contrasted, rich experience of a higher living organism is metaphysically justified because the universe favors the intense over the static.
Exactly.
And it's fascinating to think about how that concept of robbery applies beyond just eating food. We do the same thing with information, don't we?
We consume the complex ideas of others, break them down, dismantle them, and use the raw conceptual materials to build our own unique worldview.
We are constantly robbing our environment to sustain our own mental intensity, which brings us to the structure of the mind itself and the body-mind problem.
The book insists that every single entity, from the lowliest occasion to a human being, is bipolar. It has a physical pole and a mental pole.
Traditional Cartesian philosophy splits reality into two completely distinct, irreconcilable substances, minds and bodies, which somehow casually associate with one another.
This philosophy transforms the problem entirely. Mentality is not some non-spatial ghost hovering over the physical machinery of the brain. Mentality is always a reaction from and an integration with physical experience.
In a human being, we experience a unified control, a consciousness of a single unified experience. But the human body is actually the life of millions upon millions of individual centers of life.
It is a highly organized society where the experiences of the various parts, your nervous system, your organs, are transmitted to one or more central occasions in the brain.
So there is a dominant central presiding occasion that gathers all this wealth of bodily inheritance and adjusts it. But the book uses some brilliant biological comparisons to show this centralized human brain isn't the only way life organizes itself.
When we look at lower organisms, the structure is vastly different. A human has a highly centralized control system, but organisms like insects, worms, or jellyfish operate much more like a democracy.
They are harmonized, but very little centralized.
Yes.
So if I cut a worm in half, I haven't destroyed a dictator, I've just split up a committee.
That is a remarkably accurate way to frame it. The living body of a lower type is a coordination of actual occasions where actions are done with significant independence.
The parts can go on performing their functions because there is no single dominant personality in the same way a human possesses one.
As you move up the evolutionary chain, you trace a progressive rise into centrality of control. The human mind is conscious of its bodily inheritance because the incredibly delicate organization of the human nervous system transmits a massive, concentrated efficiency of experience directly to that presiding node.
And how that centralized node, that committee chair, actually perceives the world is the next massive hurdle the book tackles. It takes direct aim at traditional thinkers like Locke and Hume.
It does.
I always learned that perception starts with crisp, clear sensory data. I open my eyes, I see a flat gray stone, and from that visual data, my mind deduces everything else about the world.
But this philosophy argues that is totally backward. It stems from a profound misunderstanding of what is actually primitive in our experience.
There is a fascinating outline here of two distinct modes of perception. The first is called causal efficacy.
Think about the feeling of stepping into an old, dark cathedral. Before your eyes even adjust to the shapes of the pillars, before you can clearly see the stained glass, you feel the weight of the space, the hush, the pressure of history.
That heavy, vague, undeniable gut feeling that is causal efficacy.
It is the primitive feeling of the past, literally pressing its weight into the present. It is the vague ache in the stomach, the sudden instinctual sense of a presence in a dark room.
It is the direct perception of the settled world acting upon you. It is clumsy, it is vague in its specific details, but it is massive, inescapable, and carries the absolute undeniable weight of reality and causal influence.
It's the heavy feeling of their belledness and pastness. It's raw survival data. It tells you something is there, even if you don't know what it looks like yet.
But then we have the second mode, which is presentational immediacy.
Presentational immediacy is the mode we usually mistake for our primary contact with reality. It is the sharp, clear, geometric array of sensory data.
It is the flat, visual projection of the gray stone. It illustrates the contemporary world in a cross-section of what is called a unison of becoming.
It shows us spatial relationships, shapes, and colors happening right now, but crucially, it is shallow. It conveys no causal influence whatsoever.
Hume was right that you cannot find the cause of anything just by staring at a flat patch of color.
Presentational immediacy is a highly sophisticated, late-stage evolutionary development. It rescues us from the vague, heavy confusion of causal efficacy by providing a precise, illuminated map of our immediate contemporary environment.
So we have the heavy, invisible push of the past causal efficacy and the sharp, flat, colorful map of the present presentational immediacy. We don't just experience one or the other in isolation.
We use what is called symbolic reference to constantly weave these two modes together. We take the visceral feeling of the heavy stone and the visual image of the gray shape, and our minds snap them together so we can safely interact with the world.
And that synthesis is both our greatest strength and our biggest source of error. Symbolic reference is what allows a higher organism to navigate a complex environment with precision.
But it is also where mistakes happen, where the visual image might not match the causal reality, like being startled by your own reflection in a mirror.
The visual map says a person is there. The causal reality says the space is empty. The mind has woven them together incorrectly. Furthermore, in weaving these experiences, a living society has to balance between two ultimate failures of satisfaction, triviality, and vagueness.
Let's expand on those two concepts, because they dictate whether an experience achieves that ultimate goal of the universe we talked about at the beginning: intensity.
Triviality arises from an excess of incompatible differentiation. It happens when there is a lack of coordination in the factors of the datum.
Imagine standing in an art gallery where the canvas in front of you is covered in a million clashing neon colors with no pattern.
If a society is bombarded with too many contrasting elements that cannot be integrated into a harmonious whole, the contrasts cancel each other out.
The result is a shallow, trivial experience because the entity cannot find a reinforced narrowness to focus its intensity upon. It is chaos without an organizing principle.
And vagueness is the opposite problem, like a canvas painted entirely in a single flat shade of beige.
Precisely that. Vagueness comes from an excess of identification. It occurs when the objectifications of various actual entities in the environment are just faint replicas of one another.
The background is so uniformly identical that individual differences fade into irrelevance. There is no sharp contrast, no prominent feature to grab onto.
To achieve depth and intensity, a living society needs the right balance. It needs a massive, systematic uniformity in the background, the laws of nature, the stable room you are sitting in, to provide a reliable foundation, but it also needs to carve out a foreground of concentrated, narrow contrasts.
It needs the right amount of chaos and the right amount of vagueness to produce a masterpiece of harmony. Harmony requires the due coordination of chaos, vagueness, narrowness, and width.
It paints such a mesmerizing picture of the mind. You are balancing on the edge of chaos and order, pulling in the heavy weight of the ancient past and projecting the bright, shallow map of the present, all of it happening in the microscopic empty spaces of your physical body, driven by a cosmic desire for intensity.
It profoundly shifts how you sit in a room and just exist.
It demands a complete reevaluation of what we mean by the word now. The immediate present, this unison of becoming that we perceive through presentational immediacy, is just an extensive subdivision of the world.
It's an abstract, thin cut through the vast, thick reality of causal efficacy.
Yeah.
Our conscious perception is always an interplay, an ongoing, precarious achievement of a highly structured society trying to originate a novel response to a universe that is constantly cascading into it.
When you really let that sink in, the ordinary world completely dissolves into something so much more complex and alive.
I want you to try something right now. Pause for a second and just look at an object in your immediate environment. A cup on your desk, a wall, a window. Challenge yourself to separate your perception of it. Try to isolate the visceral, heavy, historical feeling of that object, the causal efficacy, the physical inheritance that tells your gut the object is simply there, enduring, and heavy.
And then completely separate that from the pure flat colors, the geometry, the light and shapes your eyes are feeding you right this millisecond, the presentational immediacy.
You begin to realize that everything we consider now is just a fleeting intersection. It is a fragile overlap of ancient atomic histories pressing upon you, an immediate, brilliantly clear sensory illusions projecting outward. You are standing right in the center of that collision, continually synthesizing the weight of the past into the map of the present, holding the entire universe together in a single unrepeatable drop of experience.
We're right back in the quiet of this dimly lit room, picking up exactly where we left off. The city is just a steady hum outside, and this desk lamp is casting the same long shadows across the pages of this monumental philosophical architecture. We're currently in the 5th stage of our 10-part journey through this incredibly dense book, constructing what the author calls the philosophy of organism. Our mission tonight, as we turn these pages with you, is to extract the core insights from these chapters and understand how this text fundamentally, almost violently, actually shatters the classical view of reality, specifically the monumental ideas of Descartes, Locke, Hume, and Kant.
It's the perfect atmosphere to keep unraveling this. As we move through this 5th segment, we're stepping entirely away from the idea that reality is made up of isolated, unchanging substances. We are moving away from the assumption that the universe is just a collection of solitary marbles sitting in a void. Instead, the book is going to show you how our deepest reality is made of interconnected, dynamic processes. And perhaps most surprisingly, by the time we finish tonight's reading, we'll discover how what you and I consider to be our clear, conscious perception is actually just the very tip of an enormous, ancient, emotional iceberg.
I mean, I am eager to get to that iceberg. Let's start right at the foundation of tonight's reading. The book uses the word organism, but it splits it into 2 deeply intertwined meanings, right? The microscopic and the macroscopic. I'm looking at the notes here, and the microscopic seems to deal with the internal process of an individual moment. Can you break down exactly what that means before we tackle the macroscopic?
Certainly. The microscopic meaning refers to the formal constitution of what the book calls an actual occasion. Think of it as the incredibly brief, microscopic flash of a single moment of experience coming into being. It's the internal, private process of reality organizing itself for a fraction of a millisecond.
Right.
But that microscopic flash doesn't happen in a vacuum, which is where the macroscopic meaning comes in. The microscopic meaning is what the text calls the stubborn fact of the actual world. It is the undeniable givenness of the world that surrounds that microscopic moment. It simultaneously limits the occasion and provides it with its only opportunity to exist. It's massive, it is undeniable, and it is entirely inescapable.
Inescapable because we essentially arise out of our own physical bodies, right? Like our bodies are the ultimate stubborn facts of our immediate past. We are quite literally carried forward by them. The text offers a stunningly simple but profound example to make this relatable for you, the act of finishing a sentence.
It's a brilliant example. Think about it. You finish a sentence because you have begun it. You don't just spontaneously utter the end of a thought out of nowhere. The end of your sentence might embody a completely new thought, something never before spoken in the history of the world, containing total verbal novelty. But it remains remorselessly true that you finish the sentence because you have already begun it.
It's like when I start a passionate rant about the subway system. Halfway through, I might completely lose my train of thought, or I might not even agree with my own point anymore. But the stubborn fact is, I have already committed to the structure of the sentence. I have to land the plane. I am governed by the stubborn fact of my own past actions.
Precisely. The past dictates the parameters of your present. Your present moment is always inheriting the heavy, macroscopic reality of the moment that just happened.
That carries over perfectly into how we perceive our physical environment. Because if we are anchored by our past and our bodies, how do we relate to the room we're sitting in? The text talks about our bodies having systematic relevance to the world around us. And here is where the book directly challenges what it calls a dogma of science. I read here that science often claims straight lines aren't definable in terms of mere physical happenings, but this book insists they absolutely must be. Why is it picking a fight with science over geometry?
Because that geometric argument is vital for how we exist in space. The book argues that straight lines and planes are the only elements capable of extending our systematic relevance beyond our immediate physical skin. If we couldn't define straight lines and planes in actual physical reality, we would have no way to characterize the possibilities of physical events before they actually happen. We wouldn't be able to anticipate space.
And the text introduces a few highly specific terms to structure this physical field. It uses unison of becoming, which it also calls duration. And then there's the strain locus. And I have to stop you there because strain locus sounds incredibly technical and dense. To make sure you and I are on the same page, are we basically just talking about the mental grid our brain overlays on the physical world so we don't bump into furniture?
That is a highly effective way to translate it into plain English. Imagine waking up in a pitch-black room. You reach out your hand. Your body inherently projects a geometric assumption, the straight line into the dark. That projection, that geometric relationship between your physical body and the space around you is the strain locus. Is it the structural grid that relates your body to the presented environment?
Ah, okay. And the unison of becoming.
Furthermore, that unison of becoming, or duration, represents a cross-section of the world happening all at once, the present moment across that entire grid. Without this geometry, our body couldn't use our sense perception to actually understand the world as a navigable medium. We would be entirely lost in a sea of disconnected, random sensory flashes.
Disconnected sensory flashes, which brings us perfectly to the text's massive critique of John Locke and, more aggressively, David Hume. I'm looking at the breakdown of Hume's philosophy here. Hume argued a very strict sensationalism. He said that everything in the human mind is either an impression or an idea. Can you walk us through Hume's logic before we see how the book tears it down?
Hume's premise is that an impression is vivid and immediate. If you press your hand against a hot stove, that intense burning pain is an impression. An idea, on the other hand, is just a faint, lingering copy of that impression. So sitting on your couch an hour later, remembering the heat of the stoves, is an idea. For Hume, the only difference between the two is what he called force and vivacity. The impression hits you hard. The idea is just a weak echo on a lower volume.
I have to pause and push back on Hume here because that sounds a little absurd when you say it out loud. Are we really supposed to believe that the only difference between my hand currently burning on a stove and me remembering a burn from last week is just the volume dial of the feeling? If it's just force and vivacity, doesn't that completely ignore what a memory actually is?
You have hit on the exact flaw, and that is where the text brilliantly dismantles Hume's entire framework. If the only difference between a current sensation and a memory is how strong or vivid it feels, then Hume has completely missed the defining, vital character of memory.
Which is?
Repetition. Memory is not simply a weak sensation happening right now. It is the specific foundational act of repeating something that is definitively from the past. The whole concept of repetition is completely lost in Hume's doctrine.
So by stripping away repetition, Hume essentially bankrupts his own philosophy. If you tear repetition out of experience, there's nothing left but the immediate first-handed fact.
Exactly. Hume tries to sort perceptions into classes based on how strong they feel, but he completely fails to account for the fact that one perception is claiming to be a repetition of another. And it gets much worse for Hume when it comes to the concepts of cause and effect.
Let's get into that, because Hume essentially says we never actually see a cause producing an effect, right? We just see two things happening together over and over. We see the lightning, and then we hear the thunder. So he attributes our belief in cause and effect merely to habit or repetition.
Which is a painfully circular argument. He relies on an empirical survey to prove his proposition about cause and effect, but he uses a concept repetition that isn't a valid impression in his own system. He explicitly denied repetition a moment ago, and now he needs it to explain how the world works.
So what does Hume do when he's backed into this corner?
He essentially throws his hands up. He appeals to blind practice. He admits the memory exists, and he admits we use cause and effect to survive. But his own strict philosophy of sensationalism forbids him from properly explaining them. He is forced to retreat to what the text calls an ultimate justification in practice, operating completely outside any rational systematization. The philosophy of organism, on the other hand, embraces repetition fundamentally. It argues that the objectification of the past into the present is exactly how the settled world is repeated under new limitations.
This friction with Hume really points to an even older, deeper problem in philosophy that the text is trying to fix: the metaphysics of substance. I remember learning about Descartes in school, and he gave us a classical view of reality divided neatly into three distinct categories of substances. Can you unpack what those are and why this book is so aggressively opposed to that classical view?
Descartes divided the world into cogitating minds, extended bodies, and God. And the defining foundational characteristic of a Cartesian substance is that it requires absolutely nothing but itself in order to exist. It is completely independent. It just sits there, possessing its own qualities, unaffected by everything else.
And the book argues that this is a total illusion. I say the phrase here, the fallacy of simple location.
Yes. The fallacy of simple location is the mistaken idea that you can point to a bit of matter or a specific mind and say it exists fully and completely right there, independent of space, time, and the rest of the universe. The philosophy of organism violently rejects this subject-predicate way of thinking, the idea that a substance is the main subject and its relations to the world are just accidental background predicates or qualities.
So it's rejecting the idea that a substance is like the main character in a movie and everything else is just an unessential prop.
It's exactly. In defiance of this, the text champions the principle of relativity. This principle states that it belongs to the fundamental nature of every single item in the universe to be a constituent in the constitution of any other actual entity. Nothing exists in isolation. Everything is relative to everything else.
To picture this, let's contrast a box of marbles with a tapestry. Descartes and Hume are looking at reality as a box of marbles. You can reach in, take one marble out, hold it in your hand, and study its color and weight. Its existence is completely unaffected by the other marbles left in the box, but this book is telling you that reality is actually an infinitely dense tapestry. Every single actual entity is a thread woven into the whole. You cannot pull on one thread, you cannot isolate one thread without fundamentally altering the tension and pattern of the entire fabric. Every entity feels and is formed by the entire universe that preceded it.
That tapestry analogy perfectly captures the scale of it. Now, to understand exactly how a single thread is woven into that tapestry, the text provides a painstaking, microscopic anatomy of a single moment of existence. It breaks the life cycle of an actual entity down into four distinct stages.
Let's unpack those four stages because they are incredibly dense in the text. Let's use a running metaphor to make this concrete for you listening. Imagine you are cooking a highly complex, improvised meal in a busy kitchen. Walk us through the first stage.
The first stage is the datum. This is the settled world, the stubborn facts of the past that are given to the new entity as raw material. It is the objective content of the experience. In your kitchen metaphor, the datum is your pantry and your ingredients. It is the raw vegetables, the spices, the heat of the stove, the culinary history you bring to the kitchen. You cannot change what you have been given. It is the raw, unchangeable reality handed to you by the past.
Right, I can only cook with what is actually in the fridge. I can't magically conjure ingredients that aren't there. Then comes the second stage process. The book calls this concrescence, the growing together. This is the act of cooking. I am taking all those diverse, sometimes conflicting data from the past, the sweet, the sour, the salty, and I begin to integrate them. I'm actively sorting through what is relevant and what is irrelevant, creating a new unity. I am progressively defining the final dish.
Exactly. You are actively synthesizing the given world, which leads directly into the third stage of satisfaction. This is the final, determinate condition. The process of integration is complete. The dish is plated. All indeterminism evaporates. The entity has attained its completely individual, unique self. It has achieved its subjective form. The meal is exactly what it is and nothing else.
But I can't just stare at the plated meal forever. Time moves forward.
It does. The satisfaction cannot last because the universe is a process. So we reach the fourth and final stage, decision. The entity, having reached its peak of individual satisfaction, perishes. It transitions. In your kitchen, the decision is the act of the meal being eaten and digested. Its individual existence ends, but its decision is transmitted outward. Its energy becomes the settled datum for the very next actual entity that is about to arise, the energy for your next action.
It is breathtaking when you realize what this implies, especially when we contrast it again with Descartes. The book notes that Descartes conceived the thinker as creating the thought, but the philosophy of organism completely inverts this. The operations of reality are not directed from the organism as a subject. They are directed towards the organism as a superject.
That is a crucial inversion. You are the result, not the origin. The actual world is a rhythmic pulse. It swings from the public data of the past into the private, individual integration of the present process, and then upon satisfaction, it immediately swings back out into the public world as an objectified fact.
So you don't create your thoughts in a vacuum. The vast accumulated data of the universe is actively crashing into you, forming the superjet that you are in this exact millisecond. The universe is, in a sense, cooking you.
Beautifully put. And this inversion applies just as forcefully to Immanuel Kant, perhaps even more so. Kant's revolutionary idea, often called his Copernican revolution in philosophy, was that our human subjectivity takes raw, chaotic intuition and essentially constructs the objective world. Our minds impose order, space, and time onto reality. Kant argued that the world conforms to our mind.
But the philosophy of organism perfectly inverts Kant's subjectivist principle, doesn't it?
It does. It argues that the process of experience actually proceeds from objectivity to subjectivity. The objective world, the vast datum of past actual entities, flows into us, and through the process of concrescence we just discussed, it becomes our subjective experience. We don't build the world builds us.
I have to play devil's advocate for a moment because the text uses this recurring example to explain this inversion. The stone is gray. It sounds so simple, but the book treats it like a philosophical minefield. For someone listening, it might sound a bit like we're just arguing over semantics. Why does it actually matter if the grayness is constructed in my head, like Kant or Hume might suggest, or if it's in the stone itself?
It matters deeply because it defines your connection to reality. For Descartes, looking at a gray stone was mostly about the subjective enjoyment of an experience, where the grayness was just an idea representing the world. Hume took it further and reduced the stone entirely to a mere sensation of grayness occurring only in the mind, discarding the objective actuality of the stone almost entirely. If the grayness is only in your head, you are fundamentally isolated. You are trapped in a subjective simulation.
Like wearing a virtual reality headset that you can never take off.
Precisely. But the philosophy of organism argues that primitive common sense is actually correct. The stone has an actual objective reality. The universal quality of grayness physically exists in the world, and our perception is the act of our subjective form physically catching or inheriting that universal quality from the actual entity of the stone. We are not projecting grayness onto a blank canvas. We are physically prehending or grasping the objective fact of the stone's physical state.
And this brings us to what is easily one of the most surprising paradigm-shifting insights in the entire text. It fundamentally shatters how we think about our own awareness. We naturally assume that our clear, conscious sense perception, like seeing the vivid red of a cardinal outside a window or feeling the smooth edge of a glass, is the most basic, foundational layer of our experience. We think consciousness is the starting point.
And the text reveals that viewing clear sense perception as the foundation of experience is a complete myth. It is a myth perpetuated by Locke and Hume, who assumed that emotional feelings must be derived from clear sensations. They thought you see the bear clearly, and then you feel fear.
But the philosophy of organism states the exact opposite. The most primitive, fundamental mode of physical experience is not clear sight or rational thought. The book calls it blind emotion or sympathy. We apprehend the actual world primarily through our viscera, through a massive, heavy transmission of emotional tone.
Exactly. Long before we cognitively process the specific shape or color of an object, our bodies are physically reacting to the emotional wave it transmits. We feel the world heavily and dimly before we see it clearly.
Imagine you are building a house. For centuries, philosophers have treated human consciousness, that sharp, waking awareness, as if it were the concrete foundation of the house. But this book argues that consciousness is not the foundation at all. Consciousness is just a flashlight turned on in the attic long after the entire house has been built in the dark. Consciousness only arises in the very late, highly complex derivative phases of concrescence. It only illuminates the end result of an incredibly deep, unseen physical process.
To understand exactly how that house is built in the dark, the text carefully outlines 4 successive phases of feeling, showing how we move from blind physical reception to that late arrival of conscious thought. The very first phase is dative ingression.
Let's break that term down. Dative implies giving, right?
Yes, it is the givenness. This phase is simply the raw eternal objects, the pure potentials entering into the constitution of the new entity from the settled past. There is no thought here, just pure, blind, physical reception. It is the bricks arriving at the construction site in the pitch black.
Then comes the second phase, conformal physical feeling. This is where the blind emotion really takes hold. The new entity conforms to the feelings of the past. If the immediate past was vibrating with a specific emotional intensity, the new entity inherits and reproduces that exact same emotional tone. It is a wave of pure, visceral sympathy. It's like walking into a room where two people just had a screaming argument. You physically feel the tension before anyone says a word.
That is a perfect example of conformal physical feeling. Next is the third phase, which introduces a critical shift, conceptual feeling. Here, the entity begins to isolate the eternal objects or universal qualities from the physical data. It abstracts them. It feels the potentiality of things, not just the raw physical impact. It recognizes that the tension in the room is a specific concept, anger.
And finally, we reach the fourth phase, comparative feeling. This is where the magic of higher-level experience happens. The entity compares its physical feelings of the actual world with its conceptual feelings of what is possible. It looks at what is and contrasts it with what might be.
And it is only here, in the friction of that contrast and the massive complex intersection of physical reality and abstract potential, that consciousness finally flickers on. Consciousness is just the subjective form involved in feeling the contrast between theory and fact.
When you really sit with that, it completely changes how you view your own mind. Every single time you believe you are having a pure, isolated, perfectly logical thought, you're actually just riding the very crest of a massive, ancient wave. A wave made of blind physical emotion inherited from the entirety of the universe, crashing into your present moment.
It forces a profound humility upon us. We are not isolated monarchs of our own thoughts. We are transient, dynamic outcomes of a universe that is constantly feeling its way forward. And before we move on to the next segment of this text, consider what this means for something we grapple with today, artificial intelligence. If fundamental reality requires blind emotion and physical sympathy before consciousness can even exist, can a machine made only of logic and code ever truly experience the world? Or is it forever trapped, simulating thought without that deep emotional inheritance? It is something to seriously chew on, especially because this constant, relentless drive of time means that the conscious realization of our present moment cannot hold. The satisfaction of the present moment immediately undergoes that perpetual perishing.
It dies, but in its dying, it becomes the stubborn fact. It becomes the objective, undeniable datum that sets the stage, providing the raw emotional material for the very next pulse of reality to begin its dark, mysterious concrescence, pulling us seamlessly into the next phase of this philosophical architecture.
So as we continue our way through the conceptual architecture of the book, we arrive at this ultimate goal of an actual entity, which it calls satisfaction. And it's just such an evocative term to find in the middle of a dense metaphysical framework.
It really is.
Yeah, because you sitting there listening with us might naturally think of satisfaction as just a fleeting psychological state. A momentary feeling of fullness or the contentment of having eaten a really good meal. But reading through this, it seems like the book is framing it as something much more profound, like it's structural.
It is deeply structural. In this framework, satisfaction is the final characterization of the unity of feeling. It is the moment an entity completes its own process of becoming. And there is a very specific, somewhat intimidating term introduced here, which is the superject.
Right, superject. I have to admit, that's a new one for me. What exactly does that mean in everyday terms?
Well, it's a deliberate twist on the word subject. Usually we think of a subject as something that just exists and experiences things. But the book suggests that once an entity achieves this ultimate satisfaction, once it is completely formed, it doesn't just sit there. And it certainly doesn't just disappear.
It has to go somewhere.
Exactly. It perishes as an active growing subject, but it immediately becomes a superject, meaning it becomes an objective reality, a stubborn fact for the rest of the future universe to inherit. It becomes a building block.
Okay, so my current moment of experience, once I am fully satisfied or completed in this microsecond, becomes the foundation for the very next second of reality.
Precisely. And this satisfaction is broken down into two distinct dimensions to help us understand it. A dimension of narrowness and a dimension of width.
Narrowness and width.
Okay.
If I'm focusing purely on, say, a single overwhelming emotion right now, is that narrowness.
That is exactly it.
Yeah.
The dimension of narrowness refers to the intense, isolated emotions that arise from individual components in our experience. Think of it in terms of music.
Okay, I like musical analogies.
Narrowness is like focusing entirely on the intense, piercing emotion of a single, isolated note in a symphony. In that pure dimension, the higher levels of musical coordination, the harmonies, the counter melodies, they're completely irrelevant to you. You are just absorbed in the singular intensity of that one sound.
But I'm guessing you can't have a functioning universe or a symphony with just one isolated note being played forever.
No, you cannot. And that is where the dimension of width comes in. Width is the coordination of those individual notes into a higher level of comparison. It takes those diverse, sometimes clashing emotions and coordinates them so they don't just interfere with one another and diminish their depth.
They get woven together.
Yes, they are harmonized. The function of width is described beautifully here as deepening the ocean of feeling.
Ocean of feeling. That is a gorgeous phrase.
It really is, and it marks a massive departure from older philosophical models. Instead of a rigid hierarchy of categories of thought, like you might find in Hegel, this philosophy proposes a hierarchy of categories of feeling. Feeling is the absolute bedrock of reality. And this realization transitions us very quietly into what is called the reformed subjectivist principle.
I want to pause there because reformed subjectivist principle sounds heavy. If I'm understanding the text correctly, this principle essentially anchors the entire universe in experience.
It does, yes.
It accepts the bias of modern philosophy that the whole universe consists of elements disclosed in the experiences of subjects. But then it takes a very sharp turn away from traditional empiricists, particularly David Hume. Why does he break from Hume here?
Well, what's fascinating here is that the book accepts Hume's foundational rule, the rule that nothing should be received into a philosophical scheme if it isn't discoverable as an element in subjective experience. We have to start with what we actually experience.
Right, that makes sense.
But it strongly critiques how Hume applied that rule. And you see, Hume famously argued that we have no direct impression of causation.
Right, so Hume looks at a billiard ball hitting another billiard ball, and he says, I just see one event, and then I see a second event. I don't actually see the invisible force of the cause. He thinks our minds just invent the link out of sheer habit.
Exactly. But the book points out that Hume's framework is dealing with high-level abstractions. Hume is looking at the world through a very narrow, highly intellectualized, almost sterile lens.
He's overthinking it.
He is. This philosophy counters that we do, in fact, have a direct intuition of inheritance and memory. It insists that apart from the actual experiences of subjects, there is nothing, bare nothingness. Causation isn't some mental trick or abstract habit we overlay onto the world. It is a deeply felt reality.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
Because if I look around the room right now, I don't feel like I'm seeing causation. I just see a desk, a microphone, a wall. How do we actually perceive that reality?
And that observation leads us perfectly into the chapter on symbolic reference. To understand how we feel causation, we have to recognize that we are constantly experiencing the world in two pure, fundamentally different modes of perception. The first mode is called presentational immediacy.
Presentational immediacy. What does that actually look like for me sitting here right now?
Presentational immediacy is exactly what you just described. It is the vivid, distinct spatial world you see right in front of you. If you look at a gray stone on the ground, the distinct patch of gray defined in a specific geometric location in space, that sharp, clear image is presentational immediacy.
Okay, so it's the high-definition feed from my senses.
Yes, but here's the catch. This mode gives you absolutely no information about the past or the future. It merely presents an illustrated portion of the present duration. It is just a flat, thin cross-section of the now.
Just a snapshot. So what is the second mode? What is missing from that flat cross-section?
The second, much deeper mode is called causal efficacy. If presentational immediacy is sharp, clear, and geometrically distinct, causal efficacy is heavy, vague, and indistinct. It is the physical feeling of the past rushing into the present.
The past rushing in.
Yes, it is the actual bodily inheritance of energy, influence, and emotion. You don't see it with the sharp clarity of color, but you undeniably feel its weight.
Hold on, feeling the past. That sounds almost mystical. Are we talking about actual physics and biology here, or is this just a poetic metaphor?
It is entirely grounded in biology and physics. A perfect, quiet way to understand this is an example used in the book regarding eye strain. When you are staring at that gray stone, the visual data, the specific shade of gray, the geometric shape, is given to you in presentational immediacy. It is clear and sharp.
Right, to the rock.
But if you stare long enough, you also feel a physical throb in your eye, the bodily feeling of eye strain.
I see what you mean.
That physical feeling, that ache, is causal efficacy. The eye is efficacious in your sight. You are directly feeling your body's causal relationship to the external world and to its own physiological past just a moment ago.
That makes a lot of sense. It takes it out of the realm of abstract thought and puts it right into the nervous system.
Precisely. And this beautifully dismantles Hume's skepticism with a very simple, relatable story. Imagine a man sitting in a completely dark room. Suddenly an electric light is turned on, and the bright flash makes the man's eyes blink.
Okay, reflex.
Now, Hume would look at this and, sticking to his strict, disconnected visual impressions, he would say, the man blinks merely out of habit. According to Hume, there is the presentation of the flash and then the presentation of the blink, and the mind just habitually associates them because they've happened together before.
But when you actually put yourself in the shoes of the man in the dark room, that explanation feels completely absurd.
It does, because the man doesn't just feel a mental habit. He feels the flash make him blink. The compulsion, the actual physical force of the light hitting the optic nerve and causing the reflex, is directly felt by the man. If you ask him, he will tell you the flash made me blink. I know it because I felt it force my eyes shut.
So that feeling of compulsion, that sheer, undeniable bodily reaction that is causal efficacy.
Yes. Hume tries a sleight of hand, confusing a habit of feeling blinks after flashes with a feeling of the habit. But this philosophy grounds it right back in the overwhelming bodily evidence. We feel the world acting upon us.
And I imagine this causal efficacy isn't just happening during sudden jarring events like flashes of light.
Not at all. It is the inescapable background of all existence. Even when you are sitting in absolute silence or in the dark, causal efficacy is pressing in on you. There is an incredibly atmospheric picture painted here. It talks about the vague terrors you might feel in the dark, respecting a circumambient world.
Like a heavy presence.
Exactly. Or standing in a quiet August woodland where there is no sharp movement, just the low hum of insects and the sheer, vague, heavy presence of enveloping nature that almost overwhelms you.
Like when you are half asleep and the sharp details of the room fade away, but you still just feel the presence of the house around you.
Exactly. In the dim consciousness of half sleep, the sharp presentations of your senses fade, but you are left with the vague feeling of influences from the things around you. We are never ever disconnected, and you see this even as you descend the scale of organic life. A jellyfish advances and withdraws, showing a clear perception of its causal relationship with the water around it.
It's feeling the currents.
Right. And a plant grows downwards toward the damp earth and upwards towards the light.
Right. A plant isn't experiencing the vivid, high-definition spatial geometry of presentational immediacy. It doesn't see the sun the way we do.
No, it doesn't. But it is absolutely feeling the causal nexus, the vector forces of the world around it. It feels the pull of the earth and the energy of the light.
So we have these two distinct modes. The sharp, shallow present of presentational immediacy and the heavy, vague past of causal efficacy. How do we as human beings navigate between the two? Because I don't walk around consciously separating my visual feed from my bodily inheritance.
We don't separate them. Human experience operates by tightly combining them. This mixed mode is called symbolic reference. It is the complex process where one perception acts as a symbol for another. Because they share a common ground, usually the physical space they occupy in our awareness, we synthesize them into a unified feeling. We use the clear, distinct mode to elucidate and interpret the vague, heavy mode.
I think I need an example to really grasp that. How do we use one to interpret the other?
The premier, most relatable example is language. Think about the spoken word forest. On its own, analyzed purely in the mode of presentational immediacy, it is just a very specific, fleeting sound vibrating in the air. The pitch, the intonation, the syllables hitting your eardrum, that is all it is in the immediate present.
Right, acoustics.
But as a symbol, that sound evokes a massive chain of meaning. It pulls up the causal efficacy of actual trees. It triggers the bodily memory of walking through damp woods, the heavy shade, the smell of pine. We use the sharp, immediate sound to reference a vast, heavy reality.
Or like the smell of incense in an old building. The smell itself is just a distinct chemical perception right now, but it acts as a symbol to evoke centuries of complex, indefinite, heavy emotions.
Exactly. It's a highly effective shortcut for generating feeling. We use symbols like written and spoken language because they are profoundly handy. They're vastly easier to manipulate than the heavy realities they represent. There's a wonderful historical comparison used here to illustrate this handiness. It points out that Egyptian papyrus made written language a much more useful symbolism than Babylonian language impressed on clay bricks.
Just because of the sheer physical weight.
Simply because of transportation. Yes. It is easier to carry a scroll of papyrus on a journey than a library of heavy clay bricks. Similarly, it's easier to use the spoken word forest than to physically drag someone to a forest every time you want to convey the concept of trees.
But here's what I'm wondering. If symbolic reference is this mixed mode, an act of interpretation where we are constantly bridging two different types of perception, doesn't that open the door to misinterpretation?
This raises an important question. It absolutely does. It introduces something that pure perception never has. It introduces the possibility of error. A sound might make you think of a forest, but you might be wrong about what the speaker actually meant.
Then why did we evolve to rely so heavily on something so prone to error? If it's so dangerous to misinterpret the world, why is symbolic reference the hallmark of human intelligence?
That is a brilliant question, and the book makes an incredibly striking argument here. It states that error is actually the mark of higher organisms. The evolutionary purpose of intelligence is precisely to allow individuals to profit by error without being slaughtered by it.
Profit by error.
Think about it. If an organism relies purely on blind, immediate instinct, there is no room for mistake. The reaction is perfect. But because it is perfectly bound to the immediate stimulus, there is also no room for imagination, no room for daydreaming, no room for adaptation.
It's just a machine.
Yes. Symbolic reference introduces a gap, and in that gap, error can occur. But that same gap gives us the buffer to interpret, to imagine hypotheticals, to misinterpret, and to ultimately learn and evolve.
Here's where it gets really interesting. So the ability to be wrong is actually the prerequisite for imagination, which leads us to a fascinating shift. Because when we think of language symbols and error, we naturally think of logic. We think of propositions, the statements we make about the world, and usually logic tells us that a statement is just a tool to be judged. It is either factually true or it is false. But reading further into this, the book completely radically redefines what a proposition is.
It is one of the most beautiful reimaginings in the entire framework. It calls propositions lures for feeling.
Lures for feeling. What does that actually mean in practice?
It means that philosophers and logicians have become wildly over-intellectualized. They treat propositions merely as components in cold logical judgment. But the primary original function of a theory or a proposition isn't to be judged true or false. Its function is to serve as a lure for feeling, providing an immediacy of enjoyment or purpose at the physical, almost unconscious level.
Could you give an example of a proposition acting as a lure?
Take literature. The book uses the experience of reading or watching Shakespeare. When a theater audience sits in the dark and hears Hamlet say, "to be or not to be," they are not sitting there behaving like strict logicians. They aren't rigorously judging whether the initial proposition is factually true or false in the historical world.
Right. Nobody is sitting in the theater saying, well, historically, a Danish prince didn't actually say this in English, so this statement is false.
Exactly. That kind of cold judgment is entirely eclipsed by aesthetic delight. The proposition isn't a factual report demanding a true-false stamp. It is a lure. It is drawing the audience into a specific, profound emotional state.
But what about things that aren't art? What about history or daily life?
The same applies. Consider a historical example regarding the Battle of Waterloo. We know as a factual datum, and by datum I mean the established given facts of the past, we know Napoleon was defeated. That is the actual world. But imaginative historians, or even just you and I daydreaming, often entertain hypothetical alternatives. What if Napoleon had won?
Right. And strictly speaking, the proposition Napoleon won the Battle of Waterloo is logically false. It did not happen.
It is logically false, but it is not meaningless. Entertaining that hypothetical alternative influences our emotional tone. It weaves into our daydreams without us ever consciously analyzing its truth content. It elicits feelings of curiosity or dread or wonder. It is functioning perfectly as a lure for feeling, pulling our minds into new territories.
So when I'm sitting at my desk daydreaming about quitting my job and moving to a cabin in the woods, I'm not calculating facts. I am literally luring a new version of reality into my own emotional experience.
Precisely. And this introduces a crucial distinction between propositions that are conformal and those that are non-conformal.
Conformal and non-conformal. Let's define those carefully.
A conformal proposition essentially confirms what is already factual in the datum. When you admit a conformal proposition into your feeling, it results in the confirmation of feeling to fact. It maintains the existing order. It keeps the status quo of the universe ticking along exactly as it was.
But a non-conformal proposition like my daydream about the cabin that introduces an alternative potentiality, something new.
Yes. A non-conformal proposition might be logically classified as false in relation to the current actual world, but treating non-conformal propositions merely as wrong and therefore useless is a fatal misunderstanding of how the universe works. They are the pathway along which the world advances into novelty. A true novelty, a completely new invention, a new way of living emerges into creation precisely because a non-conformal proposition was entertained.
Because someone dared to feel a lure for something that wasn't true yet.
Exactly. It introduces a new form into the actual world during concrescence.
Why concrescence? Let's pause on that word too.
Ah, yes. Concrescence is simply the process of growing together. It is the active, real-time solidifying of the present moment. It's how all these feelings and past influences fuse together to create the now. If a proposition only ever conformed to what already is the concrescence of the universe, would be an endlessly repeating loop. It would be entirely static. Error in this purely logical sense is the price we pay for progress.
So what does this all mean regarding how we actually make judgments in our daily lives? If propositions are primarily just lures for feeling and logical error is the engine of novelty and imagination, how do we ever make reliable judgments about the world we live in? How do I know the floor won't collapse when I stand up?
To answer that, we have to look delicately at the difference between intuitive judgments and derivative judgments. An intuitive judgment is the direct, unmediated consciousness of reality. It's the rare, immediate grasp of a proposition perfectly compared against the physical datum. It is the absolute, undeniable consciousness of what is. But the vast, vast majority of our everyday judgments are derivative.
Meaning they abstract. They don't encompass the full, infinite detail of reality.
Exactly. They take shortcuts. And because they abstract, they are where errors usually creep in. We rely heavily on inductive inference to survive. We project patterns from the past onto the future. There's a really relatable everyday example from the era this was written regarding the United States railway timetables in July of 1927.
Okay, let's walk through that.
We look at the timetable and make an inductive judgment. We believe the trains will run accurately in July because, according to the facts, they ran accurately in May and June. We are projecting a past pattern onto the future. We believe that timetables will be exemplified.
But there's a massive suppressed premise hidden in that simple belief isn't there.
There is. We are tacitly presuming the maintenance of the general social environment. We suppress the possibility of an unprecedented disaster. The book specifically mentions the unexpected Vermont floods that happened later that year in November 1927. Those floods completely destroyed the infrastructure and derailed the train schedules. Our inductive reasoning only held validity as long as the wider environment remained stable.
We just assume the background of the universe will behave itself.
Yes, and this leads right into a profound critique of the mathematical theory of probability. We often try to comfort ourselves by using pure statistics to justify our anticipations of the future. Think of rolling a six-sided die. Statistical probability works beautifully there because you have a tightly defined finite ground of equal probabilities. You know there are exactly 6 faces, and you assume the table is flat, and no outside forces are magically altering the physics of the roll. The conditions are artificially bounded.
But the real vast universe is not a closed dice game on a felt table.
Exactly. In the actual world, we cannot just rely on pure statistical sampling. You can't just pull a finite number of random samples from an infinite universe and expect them to give you a mathematically guaranteed ratio for the future. Attempting to use statistical theory as an ultimate explanation for all our anticipations inevitably fails because the ultimate ground is always arbitrary. We don't know the boundaries of the universe's dice game.
So what do we base our judgments on, if not pure math?
We base them on the foundational pillar of this entire philosophy. Every actual entity is in its nature essentially social. It is intricately, inescapably tied to its environment. The universe is inherent in the entity. Therefore, our judgments, our belief that the train will arrive, that the sun will rise, that a physical law will hold, are fundamentally based on the preservation of a specific type of social environment.
We are just trusting the community of the universe to continue its habits.
Precisely. Anticipations are utterly devoid of meaning apart from the maintenance of that community's ongoing relationships.
It really brings us to a lingering plateau when you step back and look at it all. The incredible realization woven through these pages is that our reality isn't just a series of cold, isolated facts bouncing off each other. It isn't a set of purely logical equations waiting to be solved by a detached mind. It is a deeply felt, intricately interconnected web. Every single lure for feeling, whether it's the poetic resonance of a line from Shakespeare, the physical eye strain of looking at a stone, or the vague terror of a dark room, actively shapes the universe's creative advance. We aren't just passively observing a static world, we are feeling our way through it. We are building it moment by moment through our bodily integrations of the heavy past and our imaginative, sometimes erroneous leaps toward a novel future.
And if every feeling we absorb, from the vague silent influences of a woodland to the sharply defined words on a printed page, acts as a fundamental building block for the concrescence of the next moment of reality, how does the specific daily environment you choose to place yourself in dictate the very nature of your most basic intuitive judgments?
We are looking at a profoundly dense, radical philosophical framework tonight. It is contained within the seventh part of the book we've been moving through.
Right.
And it asks you to surrender um, almost everything you likely believe about the universe. It asks you to just let go of the idea that reality is this vast, cold container filled with dead, static objects that just occasionally bump into one another.
Yeah, instead, the book invites you to see a living, breathing process. It is describing a universe defined by continuous creation, where the very fabric of existence is woven from microscopic, momentary events of what the author calls feeling.
Feeling.
Right.
And our mission as we look at this specific section of the text is to quietly untangle some of its most complex architecture.
Exactly.
We are going to examine how probability actually works in a living cosmos, how the flow of time moves, and how the deep hidden anatomy of these microscopic feelings eventually builds the conscious reality that you are experiencing right at this exact second.
It is a massive shift in perspective, isn't it? To sit here in the quiet and realize that everything around you, the chair you are sitting in, the air against your skin, the device playing these words, is not a collection of permanent things.
No, it's a continuous stream of events.
A stream of events, exactly. And the first major question this section of the book raises is about how we navigate a reality made entirely of events. If everything is in constant flux, how do we ever predict what will happen next?
Right, because we do predict things. We do it all the time.
We do. And the author brings us into a highly technical discussion of probability and induction to answer this. In a universe that is always changing, any inductive argument we make about the future contains a hidden hypothesis.
Meaning, when you guess that the sun will rise tomorrow, or that a rock will remain solid when you pick it up,
You are relying on what the book calls analogy and dominance. You are assuming that the environment you are about to encounter tomorrow contains a society of these momentary events that is analogous to the society dominating your present moment.
so it is essentially a natural method of sampling.
Yes.
We are taking a finite sample of the events happening in our immediate environment within our current cosmic epoch, and we are projecting that statistical dominance forward. I know the book makes a specific reference here to J. Maynard Keynes and his treatise on probability.
It does, yes.
How does this framework align with Keynes, and where does it sort of diverge?
Well, it aligns with Keynes to a point, specifically regarding the statistical frequency theory. It agrees that the laws of nature are statistical laws, derived from the dominance of certain societies of events in our current era.
Okay.
But then the text goes deeper. It reveals an alternative, non-statistical ground for probability. And this is where the terminology becomes quite abstract. The book introduces the principle of the graduated intensive relevance of eternal objects.
I think we need to pause and translate that.
Fair enough.
What exactly is an eternal object in this context? And what does intensive relevance mean?
Think of an eternal object like the pure potential of what something could be. It is like the blueprint of a house before a single brick is laid, or the concept of the color red before you actually paint a wall.
So it's pure possibility.
Pure possibility. And intensive relevance means that there is a real structural fact in the universe regarding how these pure potentials are preferentially adapted to new events. The author describes this as a secularization of the concept of a divine function in the universe.
A divine function.
Yes, but secularized. It is an intrinsic suitability. It is a fundamental drive at the very base of reality, pushing the universe toward novelty and helping to solve the indecision of what will happen next.
It sounds almost like a subconscious cosmic intuition.
That is a very fair way to think about it, as long as we understand that this non-statistical judgment exists far below the level of conscious religious emotion. It is a structural necessity of thought. It is an intuition of probability concerning the creation of a definite outcome.
And it operates completely independently of mere statistical sampling. You know, that drive toward novelty brings up a beautiful and ancient tension that the book illustrates. It is the human longing for permanence, clashing against the undeniable reality of process.
The great philosophical divide.
Right. We have the ancient philosopher Heraclitus arguing that all things flow. And that is juxtaposed against our very deep psychological need for solid ground.
We want the solid earth.
We do. We want the mountains, the stone monuments to last forever. The author captures this tension so perfectly by pointing you toward the first two lines of a famous hymn. Abide with me, fast falls the eventide.
It is a stunning example.
It really is.
Yeah.
When you sit and think about those words, you feel the entire problem of metaphysics. The words abide and me represent the permanence we desperately seek.
Yes.
But the very next breath, Fast falls the eventide, sets those permanences right back into the inescapable flowing river of time.
It is a balance that has haunted human thought for millennia. The book walks us through the historical missteps of great thinkers who tried to resolve this tension by doing what the philosopher Henri Bergson called spatializing the universe.
Forcing things into boxes.
Right. They tried to force the flowing, breathing reality into static, rigid categories to make it easier to measure. Plato found his permanences in a static spiritual heaven and relegated the flux to the imperfect physical world.
Aristotle did something similar.
He did. Aristotle gave us substance and attribute, separating the static thing from its changing qualities. Descartes gave us clear-cut, separate substances. And then Newton, whom the text refers to as that Napoleon of the world of thought, regimented the universe into absolute mathematical time that flows equably without regard to anything external.
They all subordinated the fluency of reality to static mathematical or logical boxes.
They did, but the text argues that John Locke actually made an implicit discovery that breaks us out of those static boxes, even if Locke himself only half realized what he'd stumbled upon.
Locke gave us the language to understand that there are actually two distinct kinds of fluency, two different rhythms to the universe.
Yes.
There is the macroscopic process, which the book calls transition. This is the perpetually perishing movement from one particular existent to another. It is the vehicle of the efficient cause, the origination of the present conforming to the power of the past.
You can picture transition as the relentless forward movement of a river.
Right. But then there's the microscopic process, which the book calls concrescence.
Concrescence is perhaps the most vital term in this entire book. Using Locke's phrasing, it is the real internal constitution of a particular existent.
So if transition is the movement between things,
Concrescence is the movement within a thing. It is the fluency inherent in the very makeup of a particular event, moving toward its final cause, its subjective aim. It is teleological, meaning it has a purpose or an end goal.
to borrow your analogy from earlier, if transition is the river flowing forward, concrescence is a single whirlpool within that river.
That is exactly it. It gathers the momentum of the past, draws in various streams of water, and synthesizes them into one unified individual form. The future is merely real without being actual, but the present is the immediacy of this teleological process.
This whirlpool.
Yes, this whirlpool where reality becomes actual.
Which begs the question, if we are throwing out the idea of a universe made of dead, static atoms, what exactly is the universe made of in this framework? To really see this whirlpool, we have to look closer at what the book calls the cell theory of actuality.
The building blocks.
Right. It suggests that the ultimate facts of the universe are microscopic droplets of experience. The author calls them actual entities or actual occasions.
And every single one of these microscopic drops goes through an internal life cycle, a process of feeling that has 3 distinct stages.
Let us walk through those carefully.
First, there is the responsive phase. This is a phase of pure, blind reception of the actual world. It is the mere reception of external centers of feeling absorbed as objective data.
Just taking it all in.
Exactly. Following that pure reception is the second stage, the supplemental stage. This is governed by the private ideal of the entity. The many feelings, which were initially felt as alien and external, are now transformed into a unity of aesthetic appreciation.
The text uses some very heavy physics terminology here. It mentions that incoming vector forms are submerged by the scalar form of private experience. For those of us who are not physicists, how should we visualize that?
Think of a vector form like a physical push. It has direction and magnitude, like someone shoving you from behind. That is the initial responsive phase.
Okay, a push.
But a scalar form is more like your internal temperature or your mood. It just is. In the supplemental stage, that external push is absorbed and transformed into your internal mood. The entity evaluates the contrasts and rhythms it has absorbed.
So it is deeply aesthetic.
Intensely so. Perception is heightened by the assumption of pain and pleasure, beauty and distaste. It is a phase of inhibitions and intensifications, where a color like blue becomes more intense simply by reason of its contrast to what is around it.
And finally, this internal processing leads to the third stage, which is called the satisfaction.
And we must be very careful with that word.
Very careful, yes. Satisfaction in this philosophical architecture does not mean emotional happiness or feeling content after a good meal. It is a highly technical term. It means the culmination, the total evaporation of all indetermination.
It is the final determinate, stubborn matter of fact. The actual entity has completed its concrescence, its whirlpool has stabilized, it has made its decisions and achieved its complex unity of feeling.
This brings us to a crucial reversal of how we normally think about our own existence. The book asks us to discard the traditional subject-predicate form of statement.
The way we normally speak.
Right. We usually think that there is a subject, a permanent you or I, that exists first, and then that subject possesses feelings. I exist, and then I get angry.
But in this philosophy, that is entirely backward. The feelings do not belong to a pre-existing subject. Instead, the term superject is offered as a more accurate description. The feelings are inseparable from the end at which they aim.
I need to stop you there just to let that sink in. When you say the subject emerges out of the feelings, that is incredibly counterintuitive to how we experience daily life. How does this philosophy justify flipping that around?
It is definitely a leap, but the idea is that an actuality is entirely self-realizing. It feels as it does in order to be the actual entity which it is.
So the anger doesn't happen to you.
No, the specific configuration of the anger combined with your memories and physical environment creates the momentary you that exists in that fraction of a second. Every actual entity is its own final cause, creating itself out of its grasp of the universe. The subject is the final outcome of the feeling process, not the starting line.
And there are strict rules governing how this self-creation takes place. The text outlines 3 foundational categorical conditions of reality.
The rules of the game.
Yes. The first is the category of subjective unity. This essentially states that all the many feelings belonging to an incomplete phase of an actual entity must be compatible for synthesis. Because the entity is driving toward one final subjective end, no feeling can be abstracted from its subject.
The final outcome, the superject, is already present as a guiding condition, demanding that every feeling conforms to the overall unity being evolved.
What is the second rule?
The second rule is the category of objective identity. This asserts the essential self-identity of any entity regarding its status in the universe. Within a single process of concrescence, one thing has one role, and it cannot assume any duplicity.
It has to pick a lane.
Exactly. An element cannot confront itself in alien roles. It obstinately remains itself, playing a part with self-consistent unity.
So essentially, the universe does not allow for moonlighting. A microscopic event cannot clock in as a cause on one end of a process and pretend to be something entirely different on the other end. It has to stay in character.
That is a perfect way to put it. It must maintain its identity. And this naturally flows into the third condition, the category of objective diversity. This means there can be no coalescence of diverse elements. You cannot have diverse elements exercising an absolute identity of function, devoid of the contrasts inherent in their diversities.
The book provides a very clear example of this with the concept of contrast, specifically using the colors blue and red. When an actual entity brings together the eternal objects, or the blueprints, of blue and red, it does not melt them into a muddy purple where their original identities are lost.
No, a contrast preserves the unique identities of the element.
The blue remains perfectly blue, the red remains perfectly red, but together, synthesized in the objective datum of a feeling, they relate to each other in a specific unified reality that cannot be repeated between any other pair of colors.
It is this delicate preservation of diversity within a unified synthesis that gives the universe its rich, textured reality.
Now we have to transition to perhaps the most awe-inspiring mechanism described in this section, which is the actual birth of consciousness.
The big mystery.
Up until now, we have been speaking of feelings in a way that is entirely devoid of consciousness. A rock has feelings in this framework, but it is not conscious.
Right. The text refers to these as simple physical feelings. These are acts of pure causation. The actual entity, which is the initial datum, is the cause, and the simple physical feeling is the effect.
It is a literal reenaction.
Yes, the present entity is reproducing the subjective form of the past entity. It is a blind, unconscious transfer of momentum from the past into the present, devoid of any intellectual sight.
But actual entities are essentially dipolar. They have a physical pole, which handles those blind causal feelings, but they also have a mental pole. And this is where conceptual feelings arise.
A conceptual feeling is the grasping of an eternal object, that pure potentiality we talked about earlier. And with this conceptual feeling comes the subjective form of valuation.
The entity must value this potential up or down.
It must determine the intensive importance of this blueprint, deciding how it will be utilized in the final physical integration.
And here is the core revelation of the text regarding how we think. Consciousness does not just float into existence from nowhere. It is not a default state of matter.
No, consciousness only arises from the synthetic integration of a physical feeling with the conceptual feeling. It is the friction, the spark, between what is, which is the stubbornly real physical fact, and what might be, which is the abstract conceptual potential.
When an eternal object informs a feeling, carrying its reciprocal possibilities of objective synthesis, it applies the notion of consciousness.
The book spends some time critiquing traditional philosophy here, particularly thinkers like Locke and David Hume for their sensationalist dogmas. Hume argued for the conscious apprehension of a universal, calling it an impression of sensation. He thought sensation was the basic building block.
Right, but the philosophy of organism reveals that even a simple impression of sensation is actually a highly complex late-stage integration. Consciousness is not the starting point of experience.
It is the late-stage illumination of a vast underlying process of physical and mental operations that have already done the heavy lifting of evaluating and synthesizing the past.
To really ground this profoundly abstract idea, the text asks you to consider a very specific, everyday sensory experience, like hearing the note of a tuning fork.
It is a beautiful example to just sit with quietly.
When that single definite sound reaches you, it feels like one simple, irreducible sensation. You just hear the note. But the text unravels the staggering complexity hidden within that one feeling.
First, there is the auditor, the subject of the feeling. Then there is the complex ordered environment, the vague spatial relations of the external world, and the physiological functioning of your own body, the mechanics of your auditory nerves.
And beyond the mere physical transmission of sound waves, there is an emotional sensory pattern. The note has pitch, quality, and intensity. There is a pattern of intensities, analyzing the fundamental tone and its overtones into relative and absolute loudness.
Furthermore, there are subjective qualities of joy and distaste, of aversion and aversion, which attach integrally to the audition. Pure, bare audition does not determine whether a sound is pleasant or grating.
The sound gains its complexity of subjective form only by its integration with other feelings, with past memories, with conceptual valuations of harmony or dissonance.
All of these disparate elements, the spatial physical pushes, the internal emotional temperatures, the physical causes, the conceptual potentials, all of them must synthesize perfectly, guided by the category of subjective harmony, to reach the final concrete component in the satisfaction.
Which is the conscious hearing of that one beautiful note.
It is a staggering thought to sit with.
It really is. As you listen to the cadence of my voice right now, as you process these specific words in the quiet of your own mind, your conscious awareness is merely the illuminated tip of a massive dark iceberg.
Beneath the surface of your attention, there are trillions of microscopic whirlpools, blind physical reenactments conforming to the past, and rapid conceptual evaluations of what might be, all synthesizing in fractions of a millisecond.
Every single moment, your experience is being woven together by the mutual sensitivity of countless events. It is a deeply layered, continuously pulsing miracle of completion. The universe is an incompletion in process of production, and your very act of feeling is the engine of its creative advance.
It makes you wonder if every microscopic fraction of a second is an entirely new self-creating event deciding its own future based on the immediate past.
Then the you who started listening to this sentence is literally, physically not the exact same you who was finishing it.
And that continuous completion just keeps unfolding right into the next. Welcome back to part 8 of our 10-part ongoing journey through this monumental philosophical book.
Yes, welcome back.
We're picking up exactly where we left off. And for this leg of our exploration together, I want us to just kind of settle into a uniquely quiet space. I want you, the listener, to imagine that we are sitting together in a dimly lit, perfectly silent library.
Maybe long after hours.
Right, exactly. Long after hours. We're surrounded by the dust motes of history, and we're speaking softly so as not to disturb the profound, deeply held philosophical secrets we're about to unravel, secrets about how reality actually weaves itself together.
That is really the ideal atmosphere for what we're undertaking today.
Yeah.
To truly understand the concepts laid out in this book, we have to deliberately quiet the noise of our everyday common sense assumptions.
Yeah.
And as a brief, high-level reminder of the core premise that brought us here, reality is not made of static, dead stuff.
It's not a collection of inert billiard balls knocking into one another.
No, not at all. Instead, reality is comprised entirely of interconnected events, or what the author calls actual entities. And these actual entities experience the world through what the text refers to as feelings or prehensions.
Everything at its base level feels.
Everything feels.
And our mission for this specific segment of our journey is to deeply examine this theory of feelings. We're going to explore the mechanics of how these feelings are actually transmitted from one entity to another.
Because they have to move somehow.
Right. We need to understand how abstract concepts act as lures to draw out creativity from the universe, and ultimately how the higher phases of conscious experience finally emerge from this dark, blind background of the physical world.
To begin tracing that path, we have to ground ourselves in what the book calls the ontological principle. I want to unpack this softly because it really is the foundation for everything else.
Okay.
The principle states that nothing floats into the world from nowhere.
Nothing floats from nowhere.
Exactly. Everything in the actual world, every feeling, every piece of data, every single characteristic is entirely referable to some specific actual entity. If you pull on any thread of reality, it will always trace back to an entity in the past, or it will belong to the subjective aim of the entity that is currently coming into existence.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because pulling on that thread of the subjective aim inevitably leads us to the book's incredibly unique definition of God.
Yes, it does.
And I feel we have to leave all our traditional theological assumptions at the library door right now, because in this framework, we are not talking about a human-like creator sitting outside the universe pulling strings, are we?
We are not. God is defined here as the principle of concretion.
The principle of concretion.
God is the actual entity that provides the initial subjective aim to every single newly forming entity. It is the absolute foundational spark of direction.
The author uses a really striking comparison to illustrate this. He likens this divine function to the remorseless working of things found in ancient Greek thought.
Yes, he specifically mentions Etan.
Right, Ate, the Greek goddess of mischief and ruin. And he also compares it to the inexorable laws of Buddhist philosophy. He uses the word ruthlessness to describe this initial aim. But, I mean, why would a universe built entirely on feeling require a ruthless God? That word doesn't usually evoke the divine.
It's a jarring word, and it's intentionally jarring. But in this context, that ruthlessness is actually a valuation towards order and intensity of feeling.
Toward order.
Yes, the universe simply will not tolerate an absolute impasse. The initial aim provided is inexorable because it is always the best possible aim for that specific immediate situation, even if the best available option is still a tragic or painful one.
So it's about pushing forward no matter what.
Exactly. The chaff is burnt away. What is ruthless in this principle of concretion is its relentless, inescapable drive to ensure that creativity doesn't stall out in a chaotic mess of incompatible cross-currents. Without this divine valuation, the course of creation would flatten out into a dead level of ineffectiveness. It is the ruthless foundation of progress.
That relentless push for progress forces us to address another massive philosophical hurdle that the book tackles head-on. For centuries, Western thought has been haunted by René Descartes.
Ah, Cartesianism.
Right, the disastrous separation of body and mind. Cartesianism left us with this unbridgeable gap between physical, material stuff and mental thinking stuff. How does this philosophy avoid falling into that dualistic trap?
By rejecting the iron wall between body and mind entirely. To avoid that Cartesian separation, the philosophy outlines how physical feelings smoothly give rise to conceptual feelings, and vice versa.
Yeah.
There are pure physical feelings and hybrid physical feelings.
Can you give an example of how that works?
Sure. Think of it through the analogy of playing a piano. Imagine you are watching a hammer strike a piano string. The mechanical vibration of that wire, the direct transference of physical energy, is a pure physical feeling.
The actual physics of the sound wave.
Right. But the specific resonance, your recognition of the musical note C that emerges from that vibration, acts as the conceptual counterpart. The physical data is objectified by a conceptual feeling. This is category 4, conceptual valuation.
So the mental aspect doesn't just drop down from the sky independently. Mentality originates from sensitive physical experience. The book explains that every actual entity is bipolar. It has a physical pole and a mental pole. And the mental pole simply starts with the conceptual registration of what happened in the physical pole.
Yes, it registers the physical fact and then it evaluates it.
Yeah.
But consider the implication here. If the universe only ever conceptually registered exactly what physically happened, it would be a static, endlessly repeating loop.
Right, nothing would ever change.
There'd be no art, no evolution, no new ideas.
Right.
This introduces category V, a vital mechanism for novelty, which the book calls conceptual reversion.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because reversion seems to be the precise mechanism by which entirely new things enter the universe. It's not just copying the past. Conceptual reversion allows an entity to generate a conceptual feeling that is partially diverse from the physical data it received.
Partially diverse, exactly.
It feels what is physically there, but it also feels adjacent possibilities.
It is the conceptual grasping of relevant alternatives. To bring this down to earth, think about human creativity.
Right, like a jazz musician. I was thinking about this earlier. Imagine you are listening to a jazz pianist. They hear the physical reality of the chord being played by the bassist. That is the physical data.
The given fact.
The given fact. But instead of just repeating that exact chord, their mind reaches for an adjacent possibility. A discordant note that hasn't been played yet, but fits the underlying emotional aim. They introduce novelty by reverting from the strict physical fact.
That is a brilliant way to frame it. And the author goes out of his way to carefully contrast this mechanism with older philosophies, specifically Plato's principle of reminiscence and David Hume's principle of recollection.
How so?
Well, Plato suggested that our mental concepts are just us remembering eternal forms from a past divine existence.
That the ideas are already out there in the ether.
Right. And Hume argued the opposite, that every conceptual idea is merely a faded, direct copy of a physical impression. But this philosophy limits both of those rigid applications. We are grounded in the physical past, yes, there is a ground of identity, but there is an equally fundamental aim at contrast. We can conceive of alternatives that are not physically present, allowing the universe to enrich itself with qualitative novelty.
Yet, if the universe is buzzing with all these tiny, individual, actual entities experiencing physical data and generating novel conceptual reversions, how do you or I ever perceive anything as a unified whole?
That is the big question.
Imagine you are looking out your window right now at a flock of birds. If reality is just millions of atomic data points, why do you see one flock rather than a chaotic storm of disconnected feathers and movements?
That magic is explained by Category 6, a process called transmutation. A flock of birds is what the book calls a nexus,
A nexus.
a multiplicity of actual entities. Through transmutation, a prehending subject, like your mind watching the birds, takes the numerous, simple physical feelings of all those individual birds and integrates them into one single conceptual feeling.
It brings them together.
It actively eliminates the irrelevant, trivial differences between the individual birds and abstracts a dominant characteristic, like their unified pattern of flight.
So my mind simplifies the overwhelming detail.
Yes. The subject then transmutes that conceptual feeling back into a physical feeling of the entire nexus as a single unified entity qualified by that characteristic. Transmutation is how the actual world is felt as a cohesive community rather than a blinding storm of static.
But what happens to the details that get left behind? Throughout this process, the conceptual feelings must be actively shaping the outcome. The text discusses the joint operation of adversion and aversion.
Yes, those are crucial.
If I'm understanding this right, when a conceptual feeling values something upward meaning, it passes that physical feeling on to the new emerging entity with enhanced intensity. That is adversion.
That is correct. Valuation upward. And conversely, if the valuation is downward, the physical feelings are attenuated, muted, or completely eliminated from the evolving entity. That is aversion.
So back to the flock of birds.
Right. Your mind advotes the unified motion, heightening its importance, while averting the fact that one bird is slightly to the left or another is missing a feather. Both adversion and aversion are foundational types of decision that determine what gets amplified and what gets ignored.
But wouldn't this constant pushing and pulling of different feelings tear an entity apart? There has to be an internal mechanism to manage these conflicting decisions.
There is. It is Category 7, called subjective harmony. As an entity autonomously gathers these incredibly complex, often conflicting feelings, some adverted, some averted, some reverted, it must adapt them.
It has to balance the book.
Exactly. It is in the process of growing together into a new concrete reality, which the book calls concrescence. During this concrescence, the entity adapts its feelings to achieve a pre-established aesthetic harmony in its final state, known as its satisfaction. The valuations are mutually determined to fit together without destroying the entity. Aesthetic harmony is the ultimate goal.
So what does this all mean for truth and reality? If entities, including our own minds, are constantly transmuting and coloring their physical data with conceptual reversions to achieve aesthetic harmony, how do we even define a fact?
It completely changes the definition.
It leads us to the book's radical redefinition of a proposition. A proposition here is neither a concrete physical fact, nor is it a purely abstract eternal object like the concept of redness. A proposition is described beautifully as a tale that perhaps might be told about particular actualities.
A tale that might be told. It is a hybrid. It takes definite, actual entities in the real world, which it calls the logical subjects, and pairs them with a potential concept or predicate. Now, here's where we encounter the most counterintuitive and frankly beautiful point made in this section regarding the value of falsehoods.
The value of getting it wrong.
Yes, for centuries, logicians have obsessed over judgments of truth. They categorize propositions as either true or false, and they throw the false ones into the neglected dust heap. But in the real world, the author insists it is far more important that a proposition be interesting than that it be true.
That feels almost dangerous to say in a philosophical text. Why is it more important to be interesting than true? A true proposition confirms reality.
Because a true proposition merely confirms what is already a physical fact. It adds a layer of interest, surely, but an interesting false proposition acts as a powerful lure for feeling.
A lure for feeling.
A false proposition, an imagined possibility about actual subjects, forces a contrast in the universe. It serves as a catalyst for creative emergence in the transcendent future. It lures the entity into feeling a new possibility that does not strictly exist yet, driving evolution forward.
To make this incredibly concrete, the book uses the historical example of the phrase, Caesar crossed the Rubicon.
A classic proposition.
Right. Now imagine the Carthaginian general Hannibal, who existed long before Julius Caesar. Could Hannibal have ever imagined or felt this specific proposition? Could he have dreamed that Caesar crossed the Rubicon?
He absolutely could not have, and the reason is vital. A proposition is fundamentally tied to its logical subjects. Because Caesar, the Rubicon, is a political boundary, and that specific Roman environment did not exist in Hannibal's actual world, the logical subjects of the proposition were missing.
They weren't there to be told a tale about.
Therefore, the proposition itself did not exist to be felt. A proposition is not a free-floating string of words. It requires the physical givenness of the actual entities it proposes a tale about.
Speaking of strings of words, the book takes a rather blunt stance on language in this section. It asserts that spoken language is merely a series of squeaks.
A series of squeaks.
It really strips away our linguistic arrogance, doesn't it?
It does so to highlight the profound ambiguity of language. Those verbal squeaks rely entirely upon an unspoken, massive, systematic environment for their meaning. Language is deeply elliptical.
The text provides the classic philosophical example. Socrates is mortal. When we say that, what are we actually saying? It seems obvious, but the book argues it isn't obvious at all.
It isn't. We are not saying that Socrates possesses a generic mortality in any conceivable universe. The word mortal in that proposition requires the specific systematic scheme of the Athenian society in which Socrates actually lived.
Because mortal means something specific in that context.
Exactly. Socratic means realizing a specific predicate within Athens. The spoken words are just triggers. The actual proposition involves a tacit reference to the entire locus of the world at the occasion of its utterance.
And because language and perception are so entangled with these propositions, the book carefully distinguishes between different types of feelings. It outlines authentic and unauthentic perceptive feelings.
Yes, the types of perception.
In an authentic feeling, the predicate you are applying to a nexus is derived straight from the physical recognition of that nexus. You see a green leaf, and your physical recognition gives you the predicate green. There is no reversion.
Pure and direct. But then you have imaginative feelings. This occurs when your physical recognition of the object and the indicative feeling diverge. The predicate has been altered by conceptual reversion.
You're adding something that isn't strictly there.
You are perceiving the actual world, but the proposition you are entertaining about it includes elements that are partially diverse from the strict physical fact. This is where error and mistaken perceptions arise. But as we noted with the value of falsehoods, it is also the twilight zone where art, imagination, and creative emergence thrive.
So this complex synthesis of physical facts and imaginative propositions is what pushes the universe into the higher phases of experience. We move from simple physical purposes to what the book calls comparative and intellectual feelings.
The higher phases.
These highly complex feelings arise from the integration of a physical feeling with a propositional feeling. You are simultaneously feeling what physically is and the tale that might be told about it.
This integration explains the birth of consciousness itself. The text makes a crucial distinction here that we must not miss. Consciousness is not the necessary base of experience.
It's not the default state.
No, it is the crown of experience, only occasionally attained. What's fascinating here is that consciousness flickers into existence through contrast. Specifically, it is the subjective form that arises from the affirmation-negation contrast.
What exactly is that friction, the affirmation-negation contrast?
It is the clash between the sheer matter effect, what in fact is, and the potentiality of the proposition, what might be. Imagine holding a heavy stone and simultaneously imagining it floating. The clash between the heavy physical reality and the light imaginative proposition creates a spark.
So without that specific contrast between reality and possibility, there's no consciousness. We would just be blind physical data.
Precisely. Without that contrast, there is only blind, though potentially highly complex physical feeling.
And when this conscious contrast does arise, the book states that it manifests as judgments. It outlines three species of intuitive judgments: the yes form, the no form, and the suspense form.
Belief, disbelief, and suspense.
The yes and no forms correspond to belief or disbelief. But the suspended judgment caught my attention. Why is suspended judgment so critical to this framework?
Because the suspended judgment is an essential weapon for intellectual advancement and scientific progress.
Right.
It allows us to entertain a concept without dogmatic certainty. The process of scientific theory, and even the subtlety of direct observation, depends heavily on suspended judgments.
It gives you space to think.
It allows your mind to hold a proposition, to feel the contrast between an imaginative feeling and a physical fact, and to explore its compatibilities without forcing an immediate yes or no decision. It is the refusal to eliminate the objectifying pattern, maintaining a readiness to learn from the contrast rather than shutting it down.
That willingness to hold contrasting ideas sets the stage for the final major concept discussed in this segment. Category 8, subjective intensity. This seems to be the grand driving force behind all this machinery we've been whispering about.
The ultimate aim.
The universe, in its continuous process of concrescence, is driven by a fundamental urge to realize the maximum number of conceptual contrasts, but it must do so under the strict condition of balance.
Balance is the key to endurance. Balance means avoiding the incompatibilities that would inhibit or destroy the entity. The universe seeks the greatest possible depth of intensity through contrast, but it must synthesize those differences into a harmonious subjective aim.
Which explains the physical world as we observe it. Think about the endurance of things around you: a rock, a planet, or an atom. The book suggests that physical endurance is essentially a phenomenon of rhythm and vibration.
Physical endurance is explained as a continuous chain of contrasts inherited throughout a life history. It is a stable, rhythmic character where an entity constantly balances the intensity of contrast with the necessity of stability. Rhythm is the mechanism by which the universe achieves both persistence and aesthetic richness.
Mapping out this entire journey, the text suggests three broad stages of existence. First, the stage of pure physical feeling, which is the blank transmission of energy.
Just raw data moving.
Second, the stage of pure and instinctive intuition, where propositions begin to act as blind lures for feeling without consciousness. And finally, the stage of intellectual feelings, where consciousness, imagination, and explicit judgments emerge.
And the author notes that these stages aren't sharply divided. They blur into one another, much like the philosopher Henri Bergson's evolutionary stages, tracing the ascent from inert matter to intellect.
It's a continuous spectrum.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it leaves you, the listener, with a deeply profound realization. Consider your own conscious perception in this very moment as you sit quietly in our imagined library and listen to these words. Your ability to judge these concepts, to imagine a flock of birds or a jazz musician, to simply be conscious, is the direct result of millions upon millions of tiny unconscious physical feelings transmuting, reverting, and seeking aesthetic harmony within you. You are the universe continuously and relentlessly turning blind physical data into a beautifully contrasting, vividly conscious tale.
But understanding this peak of conscious aesthetic experience is only the beginning of the final puzzle, because as we step forward into the theory of extension,
Look at the space you are occupying right now.
just take a second to really look at it, the room around you.
Right. Consider the chair you are sitting in, the physical time ticking by as you listen to this.
There is something, I don't know, profoundly humbling about realizing that none of it is what you think it is.
Exactly. As you step into this ninth part of our continuous exploration through this monumental book on process and reality, the quiet magnitude of the underlying philosophy really starts to set in.
It does. You aren't just observing an abstract theory anymore. You are watching the total dismantling and reconstruction of reality itself.
And the mission here right now is to completely break down your everyday assumptions about geometry and perception. We are exploring how every single point, line, and physical sensation you experience is actually built from the ground up.
Built entirely from overlapping regions of experience,
Yeah.
it is a staggering shift in perspective.
It requires you to completely abandon the comfort of a static universe.
Yeah.
You have to move away from the assumption that the universe is just an empty container where things happen.
And instead recognize it as a living, vibrating web of connections.
Which brings us to the first major conceptual hurdle you encounter in this section. Understanding how an actual entity, the fundamental microscopic building block of reality, can be divided.
Because the philosophy distinguishes two entirely different ways to dissect it, the genetic division and the coordinate division.
Let's make sure this is entirely clear, because dividing a fundamental building block sounds paradoxical. If it is the foundational drop of reality, how do you split it?
Right, the metaphor of a painting that you usually use frames this perfectly for anyone trying to visualize it.
Oh, the studio analogy.
Yes, think of the genetic process as the literal private act of painting. It is the artist alone in the studio.
Is the growth from phase to phase.
Exactly, the mixing of colors, the hesitations, the sudden strokes of inspiration. And the critical insight here is that this genetic process, this internal self-creation of the entity, does not happen in physical time,
It is a pure process of becoming.
existing logically prior to time. But eventually, you have the final satisfaction. The painting is finished.
It's varnished, it's dried, it's hung on the wall in a public gallery.
And that completed reality is the coordinate division. Once it is finished, you can measure the canvas, you can divide it into inches, and you can map it onto physical time.
So physical time expresses features of the growth, but it is not the growth itself. Physical time only really makes its appearance once the entity has achieved that final satisfaction.
It enjoys a specific quantum of physical time, and that quantum acts as its standpoint in the universe?
It doesn't just float in a void of time, it takes up a concrete, indivisible chunk of time and space to view the rest of the world.
Precisely. And from that specific standpoint, the actual world acts as a medium.
A conductive medium.
Yes, the underlying doctrine suggests entities interact through a vast chain. Imagine a relay race.
Okay, runners passing a baton.
If runner A passes the baton to runner B and runner B passes it to you, runner A is practically in your actual world, even if you never directly touched them.
That is indirect objectification.
You feel the impact of A through the mediation of B. The entire universe operates as this immense conductive medium, transmitting influences from the settled past into your immediate present.
But practically speaking, if every single event from the past is passing its baton to you, constantly pushing its influence onto your present moment, it feels like you are just a helpless product of history. Where is the room for choice?
That is exactly where this philosophy intervenes to protect your agency. Even with all those billions of influences pressing down from the past, those decided conditions never entirely banish freedom.
The universe is not a locked, deterministic machine ticking toward an unavoidable fate.
No, there is always a sliver of contingency left open for immediate decision. No matter how heavy the past is, the present moment has the ultimate say in how it absorbs, combines, and reacts to that past.
The conditions of the past qualify your present, but they do not absolutely dictate it.
Which highlights a profound tension in the book between the privacy of the individual and the publicity of the world.
Because every moment of reality begins in absolute subjective privacy. It is a moment of self-creation, designated here as the subject.
But the instant that process is complete, the instant the painting is finished, it perishes and becomes a superjet.
It passes into the public domain, completely objective, ready to be felt and utilized by the next generation of actual entities.
It is the ultimate cosmic sacrifice. You build yourself in private, only to immediately hand yourself over to become public material for the rest of the universe.
To explain how this transition works, the concept of eternal objects is introduced, divided into two distinct species.
The objective and the subjective.
The objective species consists of mathematical, Platonic forms. The stubborn geometric realities that dictate how things relate to each other, they are relentlessly public.
The objective ones make sense. They are the scaffolding. But the subjective species, this includes things like emotion, pain, or the color red.
And here is where I always feel the urge to push back. You're suggesting that redness begins as a deeply private emotion, a sheer intensity of feeling in one specific entity, and then travels.
That is the argument, yes.
Are you saying my anger or a patch of red physically moves through space like a baseball? That sounds impossible.
It sounds impossible because you are used to separating mind and matter, but consider the experience of seeing a red cloak. Redness does indeed begin as a private intensity.
But once that entity reaches its satisfaction and becomes public,
That redness is transmitted as an objective datum. It is not moving like a baseball. It is moving like a vibration through a medium. Emotion literally travels through the physical world as a conformal feeling.
when you see the red cloak, you are feeling a vector of emotion that originated outside of you. The subjective feeling has been objectified and passed along the chain of overlapping regions.
Which completely upends how you are taught to think about geometry in the physical world. You usually think of a red cloak as just a meaningless physical object that your brain invents a color for.
But this framework insists that the physical world is literally built out of these transmitted feelings. And that leads directly into how geometry itself is entirely reconstructed here.
Specifically through extensive connection.
Because when looking back at Descartes, who said the defining feature of physical bodies is simply that they take up space, that they have extensions, the argument in the book is that Descartes simply didn't go deep enough.
Descartes saw extension as a passive property. A block of wood simply occupies a cubic foot of space, end of story. But for this philosophy of organism, the ultimate metaphysical reality is not mere extension.
It is the active relationship of extensive connection.
It is not about things just passively occupying space. It is about how regions actively overlap, mediate, and connect with one another.
To understand this, you really have to examine the foundational definitions carefully laid out in the text. The basic building blocks of the universe are not microscopic dots or tiny spheres.
They are regions.
And regions can overlap. They can connect mediately, meaning region A connects to region B, because they both overlap with region C.
And importantly, crediting Professor de Laguna's work, they can include one another. This completely rejects Euclidean geometry.
Euclid taught you that a point is that which has no part, a microscopic speck of absolute nothingness that somehow magically builds reality.
The argument against Euclid is that you simply cannot build a real physical universe out of zero-dimensional nothingness.
It is an incredible intellectual leap to discard the Euclidean point. Instead of assuming a point just exists out of nowhere, a point is constructed using what is termed an abstractive set.
Think of a series of Russian nesting dolls. You open the largest one, and there's a smaller one inside. You open that, and there's an even smaller one.
Now imagine this process continuing infinitely. The dolls get smaller and smaller forever.
Right.
Wait, but practically speaking, how does a physical universe build itself out of something that never actually hits a solid bottom? Doesn't there have to be a foundational brick somewhere? If the nesting dolls go on infinitely, how do you ever locate a specific exact location in space?
That is exactly the genius of the abstractive set. You don't need a final solid brick at the bottom. The absolute limit of that specific infinite series of converging regions is the point.
The convergence itself provides the exactitude.
Exactly. You are defining a point entirely by the relationships of the regions converging around it, getting infinitely smaller without ever requiring a zero-dimensional dot. It is pure relation.
And from these abstractive sets, you can mathematically define flat loci: punctual elements, segmental elements, straight lines, and flat planes.
But to get straight lines, you need something called the ovate class.
This is where the terminology gets notoriously dense. If you are trying to picture the ovate class, it's not just a collection of egg-shaped ovals floating around.
Not at all. Think of overlapping searchlights in the night sky. The way those beams intersect creates a defined, tighter region of light.
The ovate class is a specific, rigorously defined set of rules for how these beams, these regions, overlap.
If a set of regions in the universe satisfies the rigorous conditions of the ovate class, it guarantees that you can pull perfectly straight lines and flat planes out of them.
By proving that such a class exists within our extensive continuum, it is deduced that straight lines are a necessity.
Furthermore, the specific characteristics of how these regions must overlap to form the ovate class mathematically proves that the physical continuum of our universe is necessarily four-dimensional.
It's geometry constructed entirely of pure relationship. And because it is built from relationships and overlapping regions, it completely reframes the ancient problem of Zeno's paradox.
The idea that motion is impossible because you have to cross an infinite number of half-distances.
If you view space as just an empty void populated by infinite zero-dimensional mathematical points, continuous transmission of light or physical influence seems utterly impossible. You would be frozen.
Zeno's paradox paralyzes you if you believe in the unbroken void. The resolution offered here is to do away with continuous transmission through empty space entirely.
There is no unbroken void.
Instead, transmission happens through successive, distinct quanta of expensiveness. Remember those discrete standpoints and the nesting dolls? The universe grows in distinct, epical drops of experience.
Therefore, objectification, the actual passing of influence, is safest to assume as happening directly only between contiguous touching occasions.
It is like a game of cosmic telephone, but instead of words getting distorted, it is the physical transfer of energy and feeling.
An entity only directly whispers the message or hands the baton to the entity immediately next to it. Everything else, any influence from across the room, the light from a distant star, is immediate objectification.
It has been passed down a long, uninterrupted chain of touching hands. Nothing jumps across a magic void. Everything is passed through physical touch.
Which brings you to perhaps one of the most evocative concepts presented in the book, the withness of the body.
All this talk of abstractive sets, ovate classes, and contiguous accretions might sound like cold, detached mathematics, but it is grounded entirely in your organic breathing experience.
You do not passively observe this complex geometry from a distance. You feel it.
Exactly. When you look at the world, you are not a disembodied camera lens floating in space. You see the world with your eyes.
You feel the floor with your feet. You grasp a mug with your hand. That is the withness of the body.
You experience this geometry through what is called a strain. And this experience is divided into two distinct modes: bodily efficacy and presentational immediacy.
To clarify these modes, bodily efficacy is the primitive, heavy causal feeling of the world pushing in on you. It is the raw, unedited data of existence.
Imagine standing next to a massive concert drum. Before you even consciously register the shape or color of the drum, you feel the physical vibration of the bass deep inside your chest cavity.
That heavy, undeniable intrusion of the past into your present biology is bodily efficacy.
Presentational immediacy, on the other hand, is the sharp, clear, geometric visual of the drum sitting peacefully on the well-lit stage. It is the polished, high-definition image your brain neatly constructs for you to navigate.
And the mechanism connecting those two modes is the strain. The strain defines a seat, which is the body of the feeler, your specific physical nerves and organs.
And it projects a focal region, which is the geometric space out there where the object appears to be located.
So, returning to the red cloak, there is a massive network of your bodily nerves receiving millions of microscopic vibrating feelings from the past. But you don't feel millions of microvibrations.
Through a biological process called transmutation, your body simplifies all that chaotic, overwhelming data into one clear, distinct patch of redness, and it geometrically projects it out into the focal region.
Transmutation is the ultimate biological shortcut. It is an act of massive simplification.
And this entire sensory framework is used to mount a devastating critique against the philosopher David Hume.
Hume famously argued that impressions of sensation, like seeing a color, hearing a tone, or feeling a texture, arise in the soul from unknown causes.
He believed sensations were just arbitrary, disconnected phenomena that pop into your mind, stripped of any real, traceable connection to the physical world outside.
The argument against Hume is brutal. It demonstrates that physical feelings always have origin vectors. Sensations do not just appear from an unknown void. They come from somewhere incredibly specific.
They are directly inherited from the antecedent functioning of your bodily nerves.
To say a sensation has an unknown cause is to willfully ignore the entire unbroken history of your own body that just spent immense energy delivering that exact sensation to your consciousness.
Hume divorces the mind from the body's history. But the sensation of red is the final conscious deliverance of a long, physical route of transmission.
This, however, raises a vital practical question for you as a listener. If your body is constantly receiving all this raw, complex, vibrating quantum data from the universe, why do you experience the world so simply?
Why do you see a solid, motionless red cloak instead of a terrifying, vibrating swarm of microscopic occasions?
The explanation is that high-grade organisms have evolved a specific survival mechanism. You are designed to focus intensely on the systematic structure of the environment and violently discard minor individual variation.
It's like your body is constantly compressing a massive, unmanageable, raw image file full of chaotic pixel data into a simple, low-res JPEG just so your conscious mind doesn't crash.
If you are being chased by a predator, you don't need to perceive the individual atomic fluctuations of the animal's fur. That would paralyze you.
You just need the overwhelming transubstantiated reality of a large, dangerous mass moving toward me.
Depth of experience is gained by concentrating emphasis on the systematic order of the world. You actively necessarily ignore the chaotic background noise so you can survive the macro reality.
You filter the universe to survive it. But in the process of filtering, you project a sense of stillness and rigid geometry onto a universe that is, at its core, constantly vibrating and becoming.
Which forces you to reconsider the very concept of rest. In a universe where absolutely everything is a fluid process of becoming, what does it actually mean for the chair you are sitting in to be at rest?
That is a deeply counterintuitive concept, because empty space itself cannot have a relationship of rest. Space isn't a thing that can hold still.
Rest is defined strictly as a relationship between an actual occasion and its own strain locus.
Let's unpack strain locus clearly. A strain, as established, is your bodily feeling of geometry. The locus is the specific geometric pathway or shape that feeling takes across space and time.
So rest is not an absolute lack of motion in an empty void.
Rather, it is a specific, coordinated alignment between the feeler and the felt. It is a harmonious way of enduing through time, where the geometric relationship between the parts remains consistent.
And this specific coordination requires an understanding of what a duration is. A duration is defined as a complete locus of actual occasions that are in a unison of becoming.
They are the distinct occasions that share a contemporary moment, essentially forming a complete flat cross-section of the entire universe.
But here is where the incorporation of modern relativity completely shatters the classical Newtonian notion of time.
In classical physics, you imagine there is one giant cosmic clock ticking away, governing everything simultaneously, meaning there was only one absolute duration for the whole universe.
If it is exactly noon for you, it is exactly noon everywhere in the cosmos.
Modern relativity proves that is an illusion. There is no single, universal present moment. The paradox of relativity is that for any single actual occasion, for the exact moment you are experiencing right now, there are an infinite number of durations that contain it.
Depending on your velocity, your gravitational field, your specific localized standpoint in the extensive continuum, your slice of the present moment will intersect the universe at a completely different angle than someone else's.
If there are infinite durations, an infinite number of valid ways to slice the present across the cosmos, the classical idea of a singular time is gone.
And this leads to a direct confrontation with the philosopher Henri Bergson. Bergson argued that when you think of time as a spatial dimension when you spatialize it, charting it out like a graph, you are creating a fake distortion with your intellect.
He believes you are ruining the pure, indivisible flow of time by chopping it up into artificial geometric blocks.
There is a firm pushback against Bergson here in the text. Spatialization is not a hallucination, and it is not a fake intellectual distortion.
It is argued that spatialization is a very real, absolutely necessary factor in the physical constitution of an enduring object.
The fact that actual occasions mathematically organize themselves into these spatialized geometric relationships is exactly what allows physical objects to endure, to exist at rest, to have velocity, and to experience acceleration.
The geometry is profoundly real, and the spatialization of time is an objective, undeniable fact of our specific cosmic epoch.
It forces you to sit quietly with the sheer scale of what is occurring inside you. Every straight line you perceive in the room, every flat plane of the wall you are looking at, is sustained by an unimaginably complex web of overlapping microscopic occasions.
The withness of your own body, the specific evolutionary routing of your nervous system, is actively projecting the geometric reality of the universe in real time.
Is constantly filtering out the infinite chaos of the quantum realm to present your consciousness with a stable, enduring, manageable world.
Your own immediate bodily feelings are secretly calculating the four-dimensional geometry of the universe right now as you sit there.
But as you look at this infinite multiplicity, these endless relativistic durations all slicing through the cosmos at different angles, these billions of private feelings transmuting into public facts, it leaves you with a truly staggering thought.
Consider this. If your body has its own slice of time, and a distant star has its own entirely different slice of time, and every microscopic cell is vibrating to its own genetic genesis.
How is it that the universe doesn't just tear itself apart into a billion contradictory realities? How do your microscopic nerves agree with the distant stars on the exact geometry of space without a central clock coordinating them?
It implies the entire universe is acting as a single, synchronized organism, instinctively feeling its way toward harmony.
How this vibrating web of abstractive sets manages to seamlessly weave itself together into the single, solid, undeniable reality that you wake up to every day is exactly where you find yourself as you turn to the next page. And as we turn to this final phase of the overarching vision we've been discussing, we really find ourselves stepping into a truly profound space.
We've reached the culminating architecture of this entire philosophical system.
Right, because this is a book that attempts something staggering. It builds a complete cosmological framework.
Explaining how absolutely everything fits together.
Exactly. In a single, interconnected web of processes.
Mhm.
I mean, we are talking about everything from the smallest, most fleeting quantum vibrations to the grandest human ideals.
And ultimately, even the very nature of God.
Yeah. So we are moving from the highly technical mechanics of how we measure the physical world straight into the ideal opposites of human existence, and finally into a quiet but really radical reimagining of the divine and the universe.
It requires a fundamental shift in how we think, a slowing down of our usual assumptions.
Because to understand the grand metaphysical conclusions of this book,
Hmm.
we first have to understand the ground we stand on.
Literally. We have to examine how we perceive and measure the space around us.
Let's take a moment to unpack the concept the book refers to as duration.
Okay.
You can think of duration as a complete set of events happening simultaneously.
The book calls this a unison of immediacy.
Yes, a unison of immediacy, which carries a lot of weight.
It does. It implies a perfectly shared present.
It does, and you have to imagine this duration as a vast, completely impenetrable barrier dividing the entire universe.
Barrier.
Right. On one side of this barrier is everything that is in the past. On the other side is everything that is in the future. No single occasion, no event at all can exist in both the past and the future of a given duration.
So it is the absolute present moment shared across the cosmos.
Exactly. It is the exact now that you are experiencing as you listen to these words. It's a thin, unbreakable slice of reality holding the universe together. And from that shared present moment, the book introduces the strain locus. Now, that sounds, well, highly technical, but it fundamentally asks how you, as an observer, or an experient, as the book says, anchor yourself in space.
It's about grounding.
Right. Let's bring this down to earth for you. If you are sitting in a room right now, simply look at a cup on your desk or the wall across from you. You are the experient. The way you unconsciously draw invisible geometric lines from your eyes to that wall or to that cup to anchor yourself in space, that is your strain locus.
It depends entirely on geometric elements, specifically lines and points defined by you, the observer.
Yeah, there is a seat of the strain, which is your standpoint, and from this seat, straight lines called projectors radiate outward. They define your relationship to the room.
It is how you mathematically ground yourself in reality. And this geometric anchoring leads directly into a subtle yet devastating critique of modern science and past philosophers, people like Descartes, Locke, and especially Hume.
We are looking at the debate between presentational immediacy and private psychological fields.
Right, because there is a rather unsettling problem in modern philosophy that the book addresses. If our senses, like seeing the color of that cup on your desk or measuring a line with a ruler, if those are merely private psychological fields happening exclusively inside the dark theater of our own brains,
Then we are entirely isolated.
we are.
That is a rather chilling thought, isn't it? I mean, if we accept that premise, then all of exact science is essentially just a shared illusion.
Exactly.
If the impression of a color arises in the mind from unknown causes, as Hume suggested, then the scientist's spectroscope is a myth.
The radiant energy being measured is a myth.
Right. When a scientist reads their notes months later, it is just a new visual experience of black marks on a white background arising from entirely unknown internal causes. If we accept that, science is reduced to the daydream of a solitary intelligence. We are just trapped alone in our minds, hallucinating a universe.
To counter this existential isolation, the book offers a defense to prove that we are directly, geometrically interacting with the real contemporary world. It uses the example of looking through a telescope.
Hold on, though. This is where it gets complicated. Because if I look through a telescope at a nebula 1,000 light years away, basic physics and common sense tell me that I am looking backward in time.
You are seeing the light as it was 1,000 years ago.
Right. So is the book claiming that I am somehow experiencing that distant star right now?
It is a nuanced distinction. The book argues that through presentational immediacy, you are actually experiencing the systematic geometric reality of the contemporary world in the present moment. You are observing the illumination of a contemporary patch of the heavens.
The geometry of it.
Yes, the telescope magnifies the geometric relations of the universe right now. The light may have traveled, but the geometric framework, the straight lines, the spatial relation between you and that patch of sky is a present reality.
So we are not trapped in a private mental projection.
We are vividly participating in the shared mathematical relations of the cosmic epoch we live in. The geometry is the bridge that proves the outside world is real and that we are connected to it.
Which naturally brings us to the philosophical problem of measurement. Because if we are sharing this geometric space, we have to ask how we actually measure it. How do you know a yardstick is a yardstick?
The book firmly rejects the idea of infinitesimals, the notion that you can measure something by approximating infinitely small, abstract points.
Because measurement isn't about the infinitely small. It relies on the concept of congruence, or coincidence.
Yeah.
Think about the simple act of moving a straight metal rod, like a yardstick, from one side of your room to the other. When you do that, you are trusting in a direct, profound intuition of permanence.
You are trusting that the 36 inches along that rod remain congruent with themselves as they move through space and time. You trust it hasn't stretched or shrunk simply by being moved.
Measurement is possible only because the universe shares a dominant, systematic geometric framework. These mathematical relations are, at the very same time, both a public fact of the universe and your private experience.
And that dual nature, the public fact and the private experience, serves as a quiet transition into the next massive concept we need to explore, the ideal opposites.
There is a warning given here, a caution that the chief danger to philosophy is narrowness in the selection of evidence. When we try to understand human ideals, we cannot cherry-pick our history based on our own personal temperaments or what makes us comfortable.
We have to look at the full spectrum of human striving. We must impartially examine the stern, unyielding self-restraint of the Roman farmers in the early Republic, or the strict, austere early Puritans in New England.
And then, we must compare them with the magnificent, chaotic flowering of aesthetic culture in ancient Greece, or the Italian Renaissance, or the vibrant streets of modern Paris.
Neither the strict builders nor the chaotic artists can wholly command our allegiance. We must recognize the undeniable greatness in both.
There is a profound greatness in the lives of those who build up immense religious or social systems through centuries of quiet self-subordination. The builders create the foundation. But equally, there is a fierce, undeniable greatness in the rebels.
The figures who storm heaven and destroy those very systems in the name of immediate, brilliant joy and artistic expression.
This tension between the builders and the rebels is deeply tied to the paradox of time, what the book beautifully and mournfully calls perpetual perishing.
As humans, we are constantly torn between two contrasting, agonizing desires. On one hand, we are haunted by the terror of losing the past. Think of the nostalgic ache you feel at the end of a perfect summer, or the realization that a childhood neighborhood has changed forever.
We crave the stable, familiar comfort of old friends, old loves, and the reliable round of seasons. We desperately seek an escape from time's relentless fading.
Yet, at the exact same time, if the past is preserved without any change, it becomes stifling. If every day is exactly the same, we develop a horror of the routine. We constantly crave the freshness of novelty, the spark of the unknown.
We want permanence, but we demand surprise. To resolve this impossible tension, the book points us toward art. Specifically, Michelangelo's masterpieces in the Medici Chapel, the statues of day, night, evening, and dawn.
When you consider those figures, reclining in their recurring, eternal sequence, you realize they were doing something far more profound than just representing the abstract concept of time passing.
The book argues they perform a kind of miracle.
They do. They implant timelessness into the passing moment. They capture the perfect realization of an essence in the nature of things. Through that art, the passing moment finds its adequate intensity by submitting to permanence. Time loses its tragic character of perpetual perishing and becomes what Plato called the moving image of eternity.
And this delicate, almost fragile balance translates directly into the relationship between order and novelty in our daily lives. Think about the pursuit of any kind of excellence. The condition for excellence is thorough training in technique, which represents order. Skill demands sheer repetition until it becomes an unconscious habit.
But the paradox that wrecks so many promising systems, whether we are talking about modern education or ancient civilizations, is that this very training, this rigid order, is apt to stifle imaginative zest.
The book uses a grand architectural analogy to illustrate this collapse. Think of how Europe once covered itself with the treasures of Gothic architecture. It was a massive, awe-inspiring system of order, with every arch and spire following strict technical rules.
But eventually, it entered a jaded epoch of satiation. Total, unrelieved order leads to a dead society. It becomes mere repetition without soul. However, the opposite is equally dangerous. Unanchored novelty, a constant striving for the new without a foundation of technique, leads to pure chaos.
So the solution proposed here is a quiet application of Aristotle's golden mean. Life refuses to be embalmed alive in pure order, but it also cannot thrive in the void of pure chaos. True progress requires preserving order amid change and preserving change amid order.
The treasures of the past, the deeply established systems and techniques, must be poured into the living occasion to create something entirely original. The settled order should deal tenderly with the faint, discordant light of the dawn of a new age.
It is about drawing intensities from the contrast between the massive background of the past and the immediate, vivid freshness of the present.
As we scale up this idea of reconciling opposites, permanence and flux, order and novelty, we arrive at the final, most contemplative proposition in the book, a complete reimagining of God and the world.
It begins this by systematically dismantling traditional theism. It argues that throughout history, humanity has idolized its divine figures by modeling them after flawed, aggressive human power structures.
It rejects the concept of God fashioned in the image of an imperial ruler, much like the divine Caesars of Rome, commanding through absolute coercive power.
It rejects God as the ruthless moralist found in the interpretations of the Hebrew prophets, ruling through fear and punishment. And it even rejects the abstract, emotionless God conceived by Aristotle as the unmoved mover, completely detached from the world.
The book argues that these interpretations have infused deep tragedy into the histories of major religions by equating divine power with force.
Instead, it asks us to look back to the Galilean origin, a brief, quiet vision of humility that flickered uncertainly through the ages. In this view, God does not rule by imperial force. God does not enforce a rigid moral code through fear.
Instead, God dwells upon the tender elements of the world. God operates by love. And crucially, God finds purpose in the present immediacy of a kingdom that is not of this world.
To explain how this is metaphysically possible, how God actually functions in this cosmology, the book meticulously breaks down the nature of God into two distinct aspects: the primordial nature and the consequent nature.
Let's examine the primordial nature first, because it is quite contrary to how most people think of the divine. Viewed as primordial, God is the unlimited conceptual realization of the absolute wealth of all possibilities.
In this state, God envisions everything that could ever possibly exist, every potential reality.
But, and this is a crucial distinction, in this primordial aspect, God is completely unconscious and lacks any physical reality.
That is correct. God's feelings in this state are purely conceptual. Because this nature is abstracted from the messy, physical reality of the universe, it is devoid of consciousness.
In this phase, God simply acts as the lure for feeling, the eternal urge of desire that initiates all creation. God is the principle of concretion, offering the initial vision of what might be, planting the seed of possibility, but remaining physically untouched by it.
But God is not just primordial. God is also consequent. And this is where the philosophy shifts into something deeply intimate. The consequent nature is God's physical, conscious reaction to the actual world.
As the world evolves, as you and I live our daily lives, making choices, experiencing moments of quiet joy or sudden pain, creating novelty, this actual world reacts upon God. Every new creation, every failure is absorbed into God's nature.
Through this absorption, God becomes conscious, fully actual, and everlasting. The conceptual nature of God is unchanging, but this consequent nature is constantly evolving. It is weaving God's physical feelings of our world upon the primordial concepts.
And this brings us to the profound concept of God's infinite patience. Look at the universe around us. It is filled with destructive force, tragedy, and the wreckage of time. But God does not combat destructive force with destructive force.
Instead, God acts with a tender patience. The book describes God as the poet of the world, leading it with tender patience by a vision of truth, beauty, and goodness. God saves the world as it passes into the immediacy of his own life.
It is the judgment of a tenderness which loses nothing that can be saved. There is no coercive smiting, only a patient harmonization of the wreckage we leave behind.
This creates an interlocking dance of opposites that is laid out in a series of paradoxes. Listen closely to how these truths balance each other in this cosmological system. The book states it is as true to say that God is permanent and the world fluent as that the world is permanent and God is fluent.
It is as true to say that God is one and the world many, as that the world is one and God many.
It is as true to say that God creates the world as that the world creates God.
These are not contradictions to be solved. They are an unbreakable mutual requirement. God is the infinite ground of all mentality seeking physical multiplicity, while the world is the multiplicity of finites seeking a perfected unity. They rely on each other entirely.
The book maps this out into four distinct creative phases of the universe. Let's walk through them slowly.
First, there is the phase of conceptual origination. This is God's pure valuation of all possibilities, the primordial nature we discussed.
Second is the phase of physical origination. This is the messy, complex multiplicity of the real world, the temporal phase we are living in right now, full of conflicting desires and fading moments.
Third is the phase of perfected actuality. This is where the multiplicity of the world, all our lived experiences, is absorbed everlastingly into the unity of God's nature.
And finally, the fourth phase is the love of God passing back into the temporal world, flooding it with meaning and flooding back again into the heavens. It is a continuous, eternal cycle of creation, absorption, and love.
And it is from this reciprocal, deeply intimate relationship between the temporal and the divine that we arrive at a truly striking definition. God is not an untouchable monarch sitting on a distant, isolated throne, passing harsh judgments.
God is, in the exact words of the book, the great companion, the fellow sufferer who understands.
Let's slow down here and truly contemplate what this ultimate cosmological vision means for our own existence. We are brought to the final lingering concept, objective immortality.
In the relentless flux of time, as we watch days turn into years, it feels as though everything is subject to that perpetual perishing we spoke of earlier. It feels like the past simply vanishes.
But we are assured here that every fleeting joy, every quiet sorrow, every moment of sharp pain, and every unseen triumph does not simply vanish into nothingness. When these moments pass, they are not lost.
They are taken up into the consequent nature of God. They are purged of their immediate blinding suffering, transformed by their relation to the whole, and they achieve an everlasting existence within the permanent memory of the universe.
Nothing is lost. The immediacy of sorrow and pain is ultimately transformed into an element of triumph. The insistent craving we all have for something that lasts, for something that defies the fading of time, is justified by this ever-present, unfading reality.
The passing of time is merely the transition of our immediate actions into an immortal state. Which leaves us with this final, quiet question for you to consider. If every action you take, no matter how seemingly trivial, is purged of its pain and woven permanently into the everlasting fabric of the universe, how does that change the way you perceive the passing of a simple, quiet afternoon?